Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jerry Chanyavsky, and I'm chair of the British Curriculum Forum. And I'd really like to welcome all of you to an event that focuses our attention on research-informed curriculum design and practice to support positive outcomes for all pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. If there's something positive that we can salvage from the effects of this dreadful pandemic, for me, it's been the time and opportunity it's given so many of us to re-examine the world that we live in and our relationship to it. This British Curriculum Forum event brings together teachers, practitioners, researchers, leaders, managers, and academics across the four nations to share your critical perspectives and assumptions about researching the curriculum, with a focus today on special educational needs and disabilities. It's hard to imagine that over 40 years has elapsed since the publication of the Warnock Report and 2 decades since the Salamanca Statement, the Keeling Schedule in Scotland, the Additional Learning Needs and Educational Tribunal Act in Wales, and the Special Educational Needs and Disability Act in Northern Ireland are indicators that we stand at a crossroads in SEND policy and practice. We can only wait to see what the extent to which the government's long-awaited SEND review is something that we're going to be celebrating or bemoaning. Since the SEND reforms of 2014 in England, children with special educational needs and disabilities and their families are meant to be at the heart of the process. However, reports and research in recent years, including one from the Educational Select Committee in 2019, have shown that this is often not the case, with families and young people still having to fight for resources, a point powerfully made by Janet Hoskin in her call to arms written for the Bira blog in the same year. Writing in 2021, Caroline Oliver, Carol Vincent, and Georgia Pavlopoulou highlight the challenges faced by parents of autistic children in lockdown, given the loss of therapeutic interventions, much needed routines, and the pandemic's ability to exacerbate many parents' already poor mental and physical well-being. Jonathan Glazard has drawn attention to the ways in which both the curriculum and some assessment systems can marginalize many learners, arguing that inclusive education necessitates both a political and a pedagogical response, saying that, quote, in the absence of a transformation of the curriculum and the assessment processes, practitioners can only go so far with inclusion. It is difficult to provide young people with an inclusive education if the wider structures that underpin education are exclusive. Today's British Curriculum Forum brings together educators from schools, colleges and universities from across the UK with a passion and dedication to all things related to SEND and the curriculum. But this work is not something that we can do on our own. It demands collaboration on all fronts, collaboration with our politicians and policymakers, collaboration with our subject associations, our examination bodies, our NGOs and charities, and collaboration with teaching and student unions, and indeed all of us that are involved in teacher education in all its guises and locations. For this reason, I would really like to ask everybody, please, to tweet #BIRA_BCF as much as possible during the course of today's event to promote the work of these amazing colleagues and to champion the work of everybody involved. We have the most thrilling lineup of guest speakers today, starting with Catherine Runswick Cole, who's Professor of Education in the School of Education at the University of Sheffield. Catherine has published extensively in the fields of critical disability studies, disabled children's childhood studies, and inclusive education. Catherine is, in her words, also a mother survivor of the SEND system. Amelie Thompson is interim co-executive head teacher at Kingswood Primary School, Whole School SEND's regional SEND leader for South East England, and interim executive head teacher for the Gypsy Hill Federation of Schools in South East London. Colin Miller is a former principal of Killard House Special School in Northern Ireland and has spent 32 years working in education, including mainstream, primary and special units. He's been a teacher, an education authority advisor, a vice principal and an associate assessor with the Education Inspectorate. He's also a very successful children's author. Luke Bearden is a senior lecturer in autism at Sheffield Hallam University. Luke has worked for the National Autistic Society as a service coordinator and co-written the Aspect Consultancy Report, the largest UK consultation with autistic adults undertaken at the time, and has been published extensively on the topic of autism. Kirsten Darling-McQuiston is a teacher educator based at the School of Education, University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Her teaching and research interests centre around inclusion and inclusive pedagogical approaches. She's an active member of the Scottish Universities Inclusion Group, a collaborative group that strives to ensure that teachers understand their responsibilities to teach all children. Margaret Mulholland is the Education Endowment Fund's Project Director for Whole School SEND and the Inclusion Specialist at the Association of School and College Leaders. Margaret is a leading advocate for the role schools play in improving the understanding of inclusive leadership and teaching. She's an honorary Norham Fellow at the Department of Education, University of Scotland, and a columnist for the TAS. Amelia Roberts is Associate Professor and Deputy Director at UCL's Centre for Inclusive Education. Amelia leads on the Youth Endowment Foundation funded evaluation of the Evening Standards, the Excluded Initiative, which focused on developing new approaches to reducing exclusions. Amelia has worked with the Department of Education on a number of projects, including co-writing 2 reports for Whole School SEND, and is currently an inclusion expert for the Standards and Testing Agency. Janet Hoskin is Associate Professor in Special Education at the University of East London. Her research interests include exploring the lives and experiences of disabled children and young people, SEND policy, and children at risk of exclusion. Janet is co-convener of the BERA Inclusive Education Special Interest Group and a parent governor of a community secondary school in Walthamstow in East London. And finally, Chandrika Devarakonda is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education and Children's Services at the University of Chester. She's worked in special schools, coordinated community-based rehabilitation projects in India, and with ethnic minority communities in Manchester. And she's the chair for the Social Justice, Equity and Diversity for the Research Development Communities in the Association for Teacher Education in Europe. We encourage as many of you as possible, please, to pose questions today to these fabulous guest speakers. And please tweet about this at #BERA_BCF. It is through this mechanism and with the help of you, our audience, that we can publicize the amazing work that you're going to be hearing about today. Our event consists of 2 parts, a main room with 2 parallel sessions. The 2 parallel sessions can be joined after the conclusion of Catherine's keynote starting in a moment. You're going to see me at various stages throughout this event, but on behalf of the BCF steering group, I now invite you to sit back and enjoy these thought-provoking presentations. Our first speaker today is the magnificent Catherine Brunswick-Cole, Professor of Education in the School of Education at the University of Sheffield.
I wanted to start by saying thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. And thank you very much to everybody who's been involved in bringing this event together. I know how much work something like this involves, and I'm really grateful to all of the people that were involved in doing that work, especially in what are still very demanding times. And thank you to all the other presenters too, and to you, the attendees, for making time to come. Now, when Jerry invited me to do this presentation, I did something that I would probably tell other female academics not to do. And I said, oh, are you sure? Am I the right person? Are you sure you want me to do this talk? And I think I was thinking, well, I'm not an expert in curriculum design. I think there are some experts coming. So if that's what you're coming for, hang on, because that is coming. But I guess Jerry, as he's spoken already about some of the stuff that I do. So if you look at my university bio, it says that I'm an expert in critical disability studies and that I've done work in disabled children's childhood studies and in inclusive education at the University of Sheffield. And as Jerry said, I am also a survivor of the SEND system, a mother survivor of the SEND system. And by that, I mean that I have a son who's now 26, not a child anymore, not a much older person now, who went through the SEND system, and he was labelled as having SEND. And I choose my words really carefully here. So I'm describing him as somebody who was labelled with SEND because he was a boy who attracted that label. He wasn't that thing. Despite the fact that when my daughter was little and she brought somebody, a little friend home from school, and as we got out of the car, she came home for tea, the friend said, "Is your son a special need?" And I said, no, he's a boy. So despite the fact that he attracted that label, I want to hang on to the fact that he was a boy, a student in education. But he was someone whose presence in school was at best unexpected, I have to say, at worst, I think, unwanted. And I also think that the curriculum was not designed with him in mind. And I use the word survivor, not frivolously or carelessly, but to remind you how challenging the system is for children and their parents, and for teachers too. And I was reminded just recently of that when I was doing some teaching preparation for our students at Sheffield, and I was talking about special education policy. And I found an image of the front cover of the 1994 Code of Practice, and it made my heart rate rise a little bit, because that was the code of practice that I had to get to know to advocate for my son in education. So, given who I am, I really wasn't sure about what to talk about today, how to focus my talk. And I was really distracted by this phrase that was banging around in my head when I think about anything to do with special educational needs and disabilities. And the phrase was, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because I feel as if all of us who've been involved in special education in some form, for me, for the last 20 odd years, first as a parent and then as an academic, I feel like we've been talking about the same things. But what, I hear you say, wait a minute, how can you possibly say that? We've had the biggest change in SEND history just a few years ago. What about the Children and Families Act? The beginning of joined up working, the end of the adversarial system. Well, to be honest, I don't actually think any of you are saying that, but I thought it might be quite good for dramatic effect. So the reforms, as Jerry's already indicated, have been highly problematic. And I wanted to think a little bit about those problematic reforms. Jerry has already done a bit of my work for me by talking about the House of Commons Special Education Needs and Disabilities first reporter session. So this much we know, I guess, about the reforms and what the Select Committee said. They commented on a lack of accountability, the lack of oversight. They described the system still as a treacle of bureaucracy. They noted that local authorities are still ignoring the law. They talked about the lack of training and employment opportunities post-16. They noted that health and social care are still not working together with education. They described the local offer as useless, and they talked about the Department for Education's sticking plaster approach. So quite a damning report. But interestingly to me, the one thing that the committee did hold on to was the idea that these were the right reforms. But I wonder if they were the right reforms. And I wonder whether they can address what I think have been persistent policy problems that certainly I've been aware of in my work over the last nearly 20 years. And I'm going to just talk about them briefly. So I think there's still the problem of inclusion, the problem of parent-professional relationships, the problem of language, that still really matters to me. I'll explain why, and the notion of needs and rights, the problem of resources, and the problem of the voice of children and young people. So I'm just going to take each of these in turn. But because I had this idea about the more things change, the more they stay the same, I'm going to share with you some examples of these things. And they were all research stories that were collected before the reforms. And I did that deliberately because I wanted you to ask yourself the question whether these stories could be told now. You can imagine, I think that they probably could, but I'd be interested if you think that the stories have changed since those reforms, or whether we could probably hear those same stories now. So the first story is about inclusion, or it not quite being inclusion. And we've got lots of examples here. So here's an example of disabled children having to stay in the same area of the playground, a sort of outside area at the back of the school, sort of shaped like a triangle. And so they were allowed in that bit, but nobody with special educational needs was allowed outside the triangle. And then another school where a mother's describing her son talking about the school and saying that children with special educational needs all go to room 101. It's not actually called room 101, it's room 134 or something, but they all go there. And he said that the school says we have so many percent of children with special educational needs, but they're not messing about with other children in the playground, they're whisked off at lunchtimes, and they're in this room. And the son says, you know, I really wonder what goes on in that room. I must go and find out one day. And then a parent talking about their hopes for the future and really feeling that inclusion for her child wasn't inclusion. And if she really wanted a place where he was going to get the best education, she was going to look, if you like, for inclusion in the special education context. So I wonder whether those stories of children's exclusion could still be told today. And I'm afraid I think they probably could. And I think one of the things that the reform really didn't focus in on, I think they didn't really think about what inclusion was. I think that those sort of examples of inclusion that aren't really inclusion that I've given you, I don't think that was properly discussed in the discussion of the reforms. And the other thing that I think didn't happen was a thought about the tension between a policy of inclusion and a marketised system. So here's a story about a teacher telling us that she was working in a school and they were having an Ofsted inspection. They were worried about being taken into special measures. So they were focusing on children who might achieve a level 4 in their sets. And so they took all the children with special educational needs out with a teaching assistant, left the other children in with the teacher. But interestingly, the recently arrived children, many of whom were of Pakistani origin or heritage, they were taken out too because their results wouldn't count because they hadn't been in school long enough. So that pressure of the marketised system, the league tables and the performance indicators is butting up the policy for inclusion. And there doesn't seem to be, to me, enough of an attempt to explore that problem and what those two competing policy agendas are, how they're interacting with one another. I also think that it's fair to say that parent-professional partnership in special educational systems, special education needs systems, remain pretty shaky. I think the systems produce, as I think the House of Commons committee agreed, that it's still an adversarial system. It was all about ending that, but we've got a parent here saying that they wouldn't let her come in and volunteer in school. They wouldn't let her in at all because she was a parent of a child with special educational needs, and another parent describing the way that they felt completely discredited and really disempowered in their interactions with practitioners. And then I wanted to return to something that Nick Hodge and I wrote about back in 2009. And we said the focus on individual needs ignores the contribution of the social model of disability and the focus on the removal of barriers to learning and participation. Here in the paper, we offer an alternative rights-based discourse. And although we acknowledge that a change in language alone cannot change practice, the experiences of the disabled people's movement suggest that educational rights discourse could enhance the provision and practice of education. It's interesting because Nick and I have been quite heavily criticised for sort of playing semantics here, but I really do think that language matters. And interestingly, Brian Lamb has recently called for a rights-based approach that should bring the Equality Act and make it fully integrated with the SEND framework, including in a revised code of practice. Interestingly, he doesn't question the language of SEND itself, so he doesn't question the idea that it's a difficulty that's within a particular child and that it's a need, not a right. But he does talk about trying to bring rights into the SEND system more fully. And then, of course, there's this whole question of resources and how we're spending resources. And I don't know how many of you are aware of the indefatigable Matthew Keir and the work that he does for Special Needs Jungle, noting just how much money is spent on conflict resolution in special education systems. And he has lots of statistics that you can look at there. And then I just really wanted to talk about children and young people. So, you know, Ofsted says that in the best area send arrangements, children and families tell us they are influential in decision making. And I think it's important that we don't conflate the two. So children and families, or children and parents, are not the same, and they have different perspectives. And I think it's really crucial that we find ways that we work harder to listen to children. But also, I know as a parent, I have anxiety about that being done badly. So we need to make sure that that's really done very well. As Jerry said in his introduction, we're waiting for another review with bated breath. Here we go again. I don't think we're quite sure when it's coming. And the House of Lords Select Committee has also called for evidence about the Children and Families Act, including, of course, the bits about special educational needs and disability. So they've done another call for evidence. And I think the reaction of parents of disabled children, certainly from my timeline of Twitter, it's a very scientific way of getting it, was basically this. And that we're into this cycle of review, report, repeat, review, report, repeat. So we've just had a review, we've just had a report, we're going to repeat the cycle again. And that was really reflected for me by this tweet where somebody said, in answer to the call for evidence, well, I'll just submit what I submitted in 2013. Maybe I'll also submit what all other parents submitted in 2013 too. Maybe I'll include a submission to the Lang inquiry and just change the date. So it feels as if all of this stuff has happened, there's been all of this change, but nothing really has changed. So people are really anti the idea that we need a review. And this again is taken from Special Needs Jungle, where a parent says fundamental redesign is not what our children need. What is fundamentally needed is a way to make local authorities and schools follow existing law as set out in the Children and Families Act, the Equality Act, the Children Act, and other key pieces of legislation. Legislative reform and policy upheaval are a distraction from what should be the main task in hand, making the existing SEND framework work as it should, rather than requiring parents to keep taking responsibility for enforcing the law. So it seems to me that we find ourselves yet again between a rock and a hard place. So we've got legislation that's not fit for purpose, but we've also got this idea that reviews aren't fit for purpose either. So what on earth are we going to do about that? We don't even know whether we should be reviewing the legislation that we have, whether that's a good idea or not. And I think in all of this, in all of the discussions that we have, and the reason that we're here is because we have to have hope. We have to find a way forward. You know, we're caught up in the system, and we have to do something that's going to have a more sort of positive outcomes for children in the future. And so now I'm going to do something a bit radical, as I talked about us talking about the same things all the time. So I'm going to try and talk about something different. And I'm really indebted to Martina Smith, who has just completed her doctorate of education with us at the University of Sheffield, for her scholarship and for her thinking about this. Because what she wants us to talk about is love. And I'm all for talking about love, because I think love is the reason why I'm here. I would never have come into academia if I hadn't had a child who got labelled with special educational needs, and I was, you know, my love for him. I'm going to guess that it's the reason a lot of you are here, that you love your jobs, you love your kids, you know, you care about what's going on here too. But what Martina says is that traditionally love has been confined to the representational realms of private lives and intimate relations. Representationally, love's association with the realm of women, home, and the apolitical has led to its marginalisation as a serious force for social justice, re-theorising and repatterning. In the context of parenting disabled children, this love provides a force for unsettling the neoliberal ableist assumptions that of individual and private responsibility for parenting that are currently woven through dominant policy discourses of parenting and entangled government policies. So it sounds a bit radical, doesn't it? So we need to think about love. But I just wanted to ask the question really, that if we began by recognising the power of love as a force for change in special educational needs and disabilities, what possibilities would that open up? If we decided to redesign the system or to implement the system that we had, and we saw love as the driving force of social justice, what would happen? And if you want to think about a tangible example of how love matters in education, if you like, when I was driving, I've been to work this morning, and many of you will be aware that there's a thing called a carer shortage. So my son came with me and we drove past his old post-16 provision, and he talked about how he had started to garden when he was there. So when he was there, he had a curriculum built around his interests. And in fact, that was where his love of gardening really began. And that's what he does now. And I think curriculum driven by what you love is what he was telling me about this morning. So I'd be interested to know what you think about love. And then if we just go to, just before I finish, I thought I'd do a little bit of work for the House of Lords Select Committee for them. And these are two of the questions that they're asking. So the first question that I think you can be that's fantastically quick result. Thank you very much. Oh no, there's some yeses. I thought for a moment they were just going to be 91%. Okay, and I'll just go to the next question. If changes are needed, could they be achieved under the framework of the Children and Families Act? Oh gosh, that's really interesting. Okay, so, oh, it's shifting. So, oh, how interesting. Oh, well, that's very interesting to see that I think it's reflecting what parents are saying, really, the kind of, do we need reform? Can we work with what we've got, or do we need something else? Okay, I think that poll is still moving, but I will stop there. And I think that Jerry's going to chair questions.
I am indeed. Catherine, thank you so much. I knew that we were going to have an absolutely brilliant presentation from you, but to have something as moving as that, as thought-provoking as that, and actually as hopeful as that, which is a strange word, but it was so lovely to see that slide come up. I'm going to now invite colleagues, delegates here to ask as many questions as possible by using Slido. I think it always takes a few seconds before people can pose their questions. So I can see at the moment, I'm waiting for the first question to come in. While we're waiting for that question, Catherine, I wonder if I can just ask you, I mean, in terms of this awaited review that is to come out, can I ask the very obvious question in terms of, first of all, what you would like to see in it, and then secondly, what you actually expect to see in it?
Oh, I would like to see a fundamental reimagination of the definition of what we mean by a child with special educational needs and disability. I would like that not to locate the difficulty within the child. I think that would make I think that's the problem for me, and why, even though I accept that we've had all this review, report, repeat thing, why I think we probably do need fundamental reform. And it begins with an idea that children are not a problem, and that all children belong, and that we don't need to fix them, and we don't need to, fit them into a system. I'd also think we need to get rid of this whole idea of, markets and league tables, and reimagine what we think education is. Do I think any of that's going to be in the review? No, I don't. I think that it will be like the Education Select Committee report, where they'll say, well, yeah, that was all the right stuff, we're just not doing it properly. Something really radical has to happen for there to be a shift, and I don't expect that.
I've got a question. I'm going to come back to you in terms of the four nations today, but we've got a question that's come in from Carmel Capewell that says, how can children be meaningfully included in contributing to their IEP?
Well, I think that first of all, we have to believe that they should be. We all have to really believe that they should be. And then I guess in one sense, it will be different for every child, and that every child might have different ways of wanting to be included in that. But I have seen really good examples of person-centered reviews where people have asked those questions about what's important now, what will be important in the future, and that sort of thing. And where people have really, it isn't about asking the child to, directly answer questions that actually none of the adults can answer. It's about really getting to know them and building up a picture of what it is that they love. I mean, my son never said, I would really love to be a gardener. He never uttered those words. But because he talked about loving being outside, other people said he liked being outside, it grew from a knowledge of him. So we have to do it in ways that respect people's ways of communication and that are driven by that, wanting to find out what that person loves, and I think it is possible, but it takes time, and it's about shifting the agenda of the meeting and thinking about the questions that we're asking. Who are they important for?
Miranda Barker has picked up and she says about love, when my daughter swapped school, the head said that they wouldn't provide anything different, in inverted commas, to other schools, but they would love her. And she says that's so important. We've got a question from Tammy Campbell saying, how in practice might the balance of power and shaping things swing to parents and children? And then in brackets she's put, and love as the driver.
I think that one of the things that I really struggle with is these relationships between parents and professionals are intimate relationships. You're talking about very quickly, often you're talking about things that are difficult and personal, and you're revealing things about your family life, and it feels very much that you're working at that individual level of relationships. And that's really difficult, especially if you feel that somebody's not supporting you. But those relationships are produced in a system that demands certain behaviours of the practitioner and of the parent. And I think it's not a very quick answer or an easy answer, but I think it's about thinking about the systems that produce behaviour. So if, for example, going back to my example of the marketized system, if a system is rewarding schools for good league table results, then it doesn't make sense for schools to be inclusive schools. It doesn't make sense for them to want to love your child or include you, differentiate your child. So I think we need to step back from seeing just those intimate relationships between people, but seeing the wider structural factors that produce those relationships and challenging those. And it's not a very good answer, but I think it's the only way that we can really.
We've got so many comments coming in and so many questions. We've got a question from Jeanette Scull, and she says, what would be needed to change in order for young people who learn differently to have meaningful access to curriculum and the learning they need?
I think it goes back to that, another vague answer, but that fundamentally important about what we understand education to be and what to be for, what we value about people. And at the moment we have a very narrow way of understanding what attainment looks like, and actually it's narrowing and narrowing and narrowing to the point where lots of children fall out of the ideal student because they can't meet those narrow versions of attainment. So I think it's about, and the government that we have is currently very invested in narrowing what attainment looks like, and we need to explode that and recognise that people have a whole range of skills that we should be celebrating and that they will be using throughout their lives, and understanding education in a completely different way.
Zora Lato, Zora, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. Zora Lato is saying, if SEND were reframed around a social model, would you prefer to see a range of schooling options or flexibility of provision in existing schools?
Oh, I think that's a really difficult question. I think that if that's a question about special schools and not, in my heart, I'm a full inclusionist, but in practice, I've seen the most terrible exclusion. But I think we could think more, the system, problem is, again, the way the system works. Once you build a special school, you have to fill those places. Once you build a unit, you create a context in which some children get called the special needs. In my story, is he a special need? You create those contexts where people are marginalised. So I think if you go back to the idea of belonging and creating places where people belong, then I guess those places could be different from one another. But whether that looks just like it looks now or something, different, if we could imagine something different, I think I'd go with that.
We're coming to the end of the session. We've got so many comments and questions which we can't possibly get through, but Christina Rose Holly says, the more knowledgeable a parent you are, the more defensive educators and leaders can be. ? I research autism and am a teacher. Not great for advocating, she says.
Well, let me tell you, I hear you. I've had that, I've had that experience too. But I just, I think that's why I need to. So I understand that experience, but I think that's not about me, and it's not about that teacher or local education authority officer in front of me. It's about the system that produces that conflict between us. And I think that's a helpful way of going forward. So it's not about bad teachers and good parents, or bad parents and good teachers. It's about the way that the system produces those interactions and challenging that.
Catherine, I want to thank you very, very much indeed. Can I also thank all of those colleagues, delegates that have put their comments in. I realise that we haven't been able to get through them all. I would like to say, first of all, that we're going to bring everybody back at the end for the main plenary at 6 o'clock, and there'll be more opportunities to ask questions, pose questions to Catherine and to our other speakers. Catherine, you've been amazing, but I always knew that was going to be the case. I'm going to ask colleagues now to make their choices as to which parallel session you're going to go to. So into the next phase, and thank you everybody so far for all of your amazing comments and questions.
Welcome. My name is Victoria Pugh. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Worcester, and my area is SEND, Diversity, Inclusion, Equality, PSHE and RSE. So this is just the most incredible lineup and a really, really exciting session. So thank you for coming to our parallel session A. And we're going to get started straight away with Emily Thompson, who's joined us.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I'm going to start by apologising about my voice. My hay fever is flaring up, but I'm going to do my very best to get through the next 15 minutes. It's so exciting to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Jerry has already introduced me, so I'm not going to go into a lot more detail. One thing I am going to highlight though, is that I'm a school leader in across mainstream primary schools. And the reason why that's really important is because I'm going to be going on to talk about some really exciting action research that we are involved in, which looks at collaboration between mainstream and specialists and how we can really bring that expertise from the specialist settings into mainstream to support us to really create a meaningful curriculum and really reflect on what it means to genuinely include all of our learners in the mainstream primary classroom. So I'm going to start off, and I'm hoping that the slides, oh, there we go, it's working. And I've gone too far, apologies. There we go. So I'm going to start off by highlighting what will be the thread throughout this presentation, and that's the graduated approach, the assess, plan, do, review cycle, and how it informs all aspects of our provision, including curriculum design. And I feel it's really central, not just to inclusive practice, but also to the leadership of inclusion and inclusive practice. And my starting point is that it does inform all of our practice, that it's central to every teaching interaction, every micro and macro intervention, and also essential when we're zooming in more closely on the specific provision for children with more complex needs. And I am going to stress again with this slide just how important I think the graduated approach is and how central it is to all practice in our schools. So thinking about our summative assessment points and how they inform strategic long and medium term planning, both within the classroom and at a whole school development level. And I always find it really interesting to reflect on the parallels that can be drawn between the EEF implementation guidance and the assess, plan, do, review cycle when thinking about that. It also informs our formative assessment, our assessment for learning, our everyday interactions and interventions within the classroom. And for those learners with more complex needs, the cycle tightens. And as it says that on the slide, that cycle that starts with noticing, that starts with gathering information, that repeats itself as we deepen our knowledge and adapt and adjust our provision accordingly, allows us to really, really think about the children with more, more complex. So I'm very aware of my language now following Catherine's presentation, but that there's more complex learners that within our classrooms and how we can use that. And I think it's also really important to reflect on the fact that as we zoom in, as we use that assess, plan, do, review cycle to zoom in on particular individual children in our classes, whose provision we need to think more carefully about in order to ensure that we are giving them the right to the education that they have a right to. Conversely, we're also broadening out those who are involved. So moving from that sort of triangle of the teacher, the family, and the learner as the educators, to the involvement of other professionals, both in school, but also in external agencies as that provision becomes more specialised. Now, obviously, that's really necessary in ensuring that we achieve the best possible provision for our learners. But I do think it carries real risks when we reflect on that question of genuine inclusion within the mainstream classroom. Who has the oversight and who has the ownership? Who holds the actual accountability for the child's lived experience? And we know what the legislation says. We know what the expectation is within that legislation, every teacher being a teacher of SEND. But how do we ensure that that's reflected in reality? How do we ensure that intervention doesn't become synonymous with withdrawal and actually ensures that we're increasing access and we're increasing opportunity? And how do we ensure that agency stays at the heart of those learning experiences and that learning journey as well? And another point I want to just reflect on at this stage is what we mean when we're talking about whole class and whole school approaches to support inclusion. Now, as regional lead for that as part of the whole school SEND team, obviously I spend a lot of time talking about this, and ensuring a strong universal provision is in place is absolutely essential, but it's not separate from ensuring that there's appropriate access to targeted and specialist interventional support where appropriate. And I think it's really important to reflect on that, not just when considering broader resource deployment, which I think is how this is often spoken about when we're thinking about the strategic leadership of SEND, but also thinking about it when we're thinking about provision for individual children, and really considering carefully when targeted and specialist support is appropriate and necessary, and how that support is going to increase access to the curriculum and opportunities. Both within, broadly across their learning journey, but also within the school day or across a week, across a term, and their interactions with their educational experiences. And I'm sure that we can all think of examples where we can recall the deployment of targeted and specialist resources that excluded rather than included, that reduced access to opportunities as opposed to actually increased access. And I'm just going to skip a couple of slides and come back to this one, because I want to, on that point, just reflect on this case study, which is included in the Whole School SEND resource, the Teacher Handbook for SEND, and was written by Philippa Stobbs. And I will read it out, you know, and I guess the clue really is in the title of the slide, you know, exclusion by inclusion, which again, we've already spoken about. I'm observing 3 5-year-old children playing with modelling dough. An adult is sitting with them and is allocated to a disabled child who's one of the 3. Paula uses a wheelchair, but is supported in an especially constructed chair at the table so that she's at the right height. And in addition to her physical impairment, Paula has epilepsy and has to be monitored carefully as it's proving difficult to balance her medication. 2 of the children are interacting quite a bit, leaning into each other, pointing, talking about their models constructively, and by invitation, adjusting each other's models. They talk to the adult and the adult talks to them. Paula addresses the adult and the adult addresses her, but not once in half an hour do the 2 children interact with Paula, and not once does Paula address one of them. And there's so much learning that we could take from that case study, but I just want to go back and focus on one point, and the importance that stresses really on considering all aspects of our practice when we're thinking about inclusion, and really bringing it back to the child's lived experience, so that we're thinking about it from a built-in, not bolt-on approach, the relationships, the classroom organisation, the physical environment, as well as our teaching practices and routine. And also really thinking really carefully about what that actually means in reality for our most complex learners. And this has been a real driver for this action research that I will come to speak to in a little bit more detail in just a minute. Sorry, I'm just taking a bit of time for the slides to come through. There we go. So, you know, as the title of this slide suggests, I think it is about more than just inclusion, but really thinking about what this means. Now, for some children, we know it's about supporting them with different routes to achieve the same or similar goal. And I think sometimes that this can be our general approach in mainstream. How can I adapt my lessons so that they're able to engage with the learning objective that is being taught? How can we support the children to move through their education so that they're achieving at age-related expectation? And if they're not doing that, how can I close the gap? But it's more complex than this. You know, what about those children for whom that pathway is not appropriate? What about those children who need a different pathway in order to ensure that we meet their right to have access to appropriate education? And this isn't the time, you know, to debate whether this is about mainstream or specialist, but I did want to highlight learning that I've taken from my own conversations with SENCOs that I've worked with, who came back from a visit from Swiss Cottage, and they commented on the fact that there were far greater opportunities for the learners to develop their independence and grow as learners, and a real sense that we felt that we were not preparing them as well for adulthood as we could and as we should be. And, you know, but this is really enshrined. It's enshrined there in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, that we have a tendency, we've named that we have a tendency to see each year in isolation, each learning unit in isolation, and at times every lesson in isolation as we deliver the curriculum. And we lose sight of the learning journey, preparation for adulthood from the earliest years, and don't give enough consideration to the long-term outcomes for our most complex learners. And this has really been the driver behind the key question around the Action Research project that we're currently involved in. It's been funded by the Laurel Trust, and it's in partnership with Merton Special Training Association. Really focusing in on how can that collaboration between specialists and mainstream leaders and teachers support us to improve our practice, and therefore the outcomes and meaningful inclusion for our most complex learners. How can we learn from our specialist colleagues and bring their expertise into the mainstream classroom, not in a way that focuses on specialist provision for individual children, but in a way that impacts our practice and develops our expertise to be able to meaningfully assess and plan for our most complex learners. I'm not going to read the project aims, you can see them on that slide. And I do also want to stress that this is an action research project that is in progress. There's lots of learning taking place currently, much more learning to come. But I think what we're really noticing is the impact on curriculum planning and the way it's making us think about it differently. So our default position has been to plan the lesson and then think about how we'll adapt the lesson or differentiate the lesson in order to make it accessible to the child. And the unintended consequence of that being that we can end up planning day to day for our most complex learners who actually need a much clearer, where it's even more important that they have a clear sense of learning journey. And we're beginning to shift this and start thinking about it with the starting point of the learner, really thinking about what those long-term outcomes are, what the key targets, and thinking about those overarching objectives that ensure that their pathways are considered as a starting point to give them meaningful opportunities within the whole class teaching. So thinking about them first, and then through that building in opportunities or having more opportunities to build in independent work, to build in those key opportunities for overlearning, applying knowledge, applying their skills, and then with that also seeing the impact that that has on their confidence, their self-esteem and their independence. And we're already seeing that engagement, that confidence. And one of the teachers who's involved in the project has described it as liberating both for the teacher and the learner, as we focus less on doing more and more on using the resource that we have to do the right thing. So I know I've got one, I think I've probably got about 30 seconds left, so I'm going to just end where I started, which is with the graduated approach, the assess, plan, do, review cycle. And a reflection from me about how we spend a lot of time doing in schools, and that we need to give ourselves the tools, the opportunities, the time, the expertise to ensure that we're getting the balance right between these 4 parts of the cycle. And this is going to be important for all of our learners, but all the more important for our most complex learners. And in doing so, we're ensuring that we're focusing on the learning journey rather than taking a more piecemeal approach of that day to day. So we're really thinking about giving them access to what is happening in the classroom rather than trying to bolt on what we think they need that we're not able to give them. So I'm going to stop there and hand back over to Victoria.
Amelie, thank you so much. Gosh, so much to think about there in terms of putting that learner first. We're going to just move on now so that you can hear all of the speakers. And don't forget that you can ask questions anytime, which we'll put to the panel at the end of these sessions. So thank you very much, Amelie. I would like to introduce now Colin Miller, MBE, to come and talk to us. So over to you, Colin.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me okay, Victoria? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, you're nice and clear.
Okay, thank you. I'm coming all the way from Northern Ireland, so I have to shout loudly. Lovely to be here. Thank you so much for including me in this afternoon and this early evening's event. I'm going to focus on very much a very practical point to the approach of SEND, and that is from my experience of working both in mainstream special units and special schools, which I would be a very firm supporter of. To support inclusion. Inclusion is not just a dichotomy, mainstream against special. It's very much a union between the two, and giving the child the right education in the right environment and the right trained staff. But one of the areas I've noticed when I was in the inclusion inspectorate team here in Northern Ireland was the issue of teacher talk, in that we focus so much on certain approaches, certain resources, but one thing we don't put the focus on is how we actually engage our young children, and particularly those young children with special education needs or additional needs. And this is something now that we would train all our specialist teachers in as part of their training. And this is to make sure that their communication is a help and not a hindrance to the child understanding what has been expected of them. And I'm going to take you through the language bus journey to help you think about how you deliver and how you talk to your students, to think about a bus going on a journey. So basically, if you think about your ears being the bus station when the bus is going to leave, and the words that you are saying as the passengers going on and off the bus, and the brain hemispheres for processing verbal information is that the destination stations, then you think about, first of all, the start of the journey. And the simple thing, you may think this is such common sense, but in a busy class, this is often not the case, where a teacher or an adult in the class is talking over a background noise. Simply reduce the background noise, first of all, before you speak. And this acts like the announcer in the bus station calling out the bus number. And this ensures that the attention of the passengers is gained before further information is presented. So it allows the child to stop what they're doing, to turn and look towards the source of verbal information, and then you're ready to start your bus journey. You've heard your bus being called. Next slide. Thank you. So getting on and off the bus. These are called keywords, information carrying words. In every statement, every sentence you say, there are certain words that convey more meaning. So what you do is you raise these words slightly with the intonation. Now, we're not talking about raising our voice up and down, but the brain picks up milliseconds and decibels of difference. And so you'll be saying, you know, for example, if I wanted my class to line up the door, the child to the door, the instruction would be, would you go to the door? Then the most information carrying words there are the word go and door. So I would say, would you go to the door? This allows the keywords to convey the most meaning and for the passengers to then get on the right order on the bus. So they start to board the bus in the correct way. Next slide, thank you. Another one is called the repeat, rephrase, and use short phrases. On the bus journey, this allows the driver to repeat the destinations and the bus number. So it allows the passenger to know I'm on the right journey, I'm on the right bus. It allows the passengers to board in an orderly manner. So it ensures that the information is reaching the brain center in the right order, in the right manner. For example, I would say, previous example, I would like you to go to the door. Can you go to the door? Where are you going? To the door. So that allows those passengers to make sure they're in the right order on the right bus getting on. So when they get off, the brain is assimilating the information the best possible way and understanding is achieved. Next, thank you. The keywords I talked about that convey the most meaning, they also act as the Disney fast track tickets. We all been to Disney where you have a fast track, you jump to the front of the queue and you get on the ride quicker. Well, what the keywords also do, as well as confirming the order, they also then go to the front. So the keywords carrying the key information that you want the child to assimilate get on the bus first and off the bus first. And that means that those information words that carry the key meaning are assimilated by the child without being confused with the superfluous other words that are spoken in the English language. So for children with special needs, obviously limited language, because most children have got some element of verbal processing or language receptive or expressive delay, and usually the visual way is the way into the brain. But as adults, we talk in the classroom, it is a verbal environment, but we need to make sure our verbal is not hindering understanding by the child with limited receptive language maybe abilities. So that is the key words. So we're talking about reducing the noise, emphasizing the keywords, shortening the phrases so the passengers board on small groups as opposed to all rushing at one time. And this is allowing all the information to go to the brain simulation centers in the brain and getting off in the correct way, conveying all the meaning of what you're asking or telling the child to assimilate. Next question. Sorry, next slide. Pause between instructions. I know in Northern Ireland here, it may be a cultural thing. We speak very, very, very quickly all the time. But generally, the speed of an adult language is much faster than the speed of a child's language, research tells us. So by pausing, you're allowing, once again, those passengers to board in the right order, in the right groups. When you speak quickly or convey too many words, they trip over each other, they push each other out of order, and they get on the wrong order, and they get off on the wrong order, causing confusion and causing very poor assimilation of what was asked. So basically, you know, I would say to the child with special needs, if I want him to get his colouring pencils out, go to your school bag, get out your colouring pencils. As opposed to as an adult saying to an adult in the same situation, go to your bag and get your colouring pencils out. As an adult, we can process much more words. But with a child's brain, and particularly a child with a learning disability or a learning need, they need to have them slow down and pause between instructions to allow that information to make the journey and be assimilated. So simply putting a pause in works wonders. Next slide. Use visual clues. We all know on the ASD or autistic spectrum, visual clues, visual prompts is useful, but it's also useful for a range of other special education additional needs as a backup or as the main way of processing information. So on the bus, the visual clues act as the sat nav for the bus driver, allowing them to have visual confirmation if they're on the right journey or where they're going. And it ensures multi-sensory information is being given to that child to allow the maximum understanding and assimilation of the information. For example, earlier on, to make the child go to the door, I would say, once again, I would like you to go to the door. And then I would repeat, I want you to go to the door. Where are you going to? The door. And then I would point towards the door with my finger, my arm outstretched, and that is the visual clue. Government health warning, do not use the visual clue when speaking and using visual clue. Use them separately because that can cause confusion. So once again, the visual clue is the sat nav. Next slide. The language bus here, slow down, which is quite like the pause button, because this is allowing the child to take the information in at a steady pace, to organize it, to assimilate it, and then to complete what the action is required. And this is the bus passengers, the words getting on the right order, getting off in the wrong order, the words that convey the most meaning, being at the front of the queue, first on, first off, and it just allows the child to experience success simply by the adult, the teacher, focusing on the delivery and the words that they're using and how they're delivering that. And it's amazing the differences will make. And by slowing down, prevents misunderstanding and confusion. Next slide. I'm getting near the end. Ensure the vocabulary is known. Use words that children do know. These words that are familiar act as the tickets that clarify they're on the right bus, the right journey, and they're getting off at the right station at the right time. The action is the right station. So use words that they're familiar with, that they know, not words that you assume that they know. Next slide. So basically, to summarize, adult language is so much a part of communication, but often in the classrooms, in mainstream or specialist provision, the teacher's language is not something that's focused on. We're focusing on the particular resource or particular program we're using and forgetting that the most crucial tool is the teacher or the adult's communication with that child. And the adult's communication can be a help or a hindrance. So let's make sure it's a help and allow our children with additional needs to show their true abilities, because we are opening the door for their learning to occur. Communication is more than just talking. Thank you very much. It's a very quick run through. I normally spend 3 hours on this when doing the training, but I hope it pinpoints the important point of look at your language before you speak in the classroom to a child with additional needs. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Colin. Gosh, lots of really interesting points there, and links so well to that graduated approach and quality first teaching and all of those things that we should be doing all the time for all of our learners. So thank you very much. We're going to move on now to Luke Bearden, who's going to talk to us. But please do remember that you can pop questions in that Q&A box at any time as they come up, something the speaker says and you just want to ask, and we'll look at those at the end. So over to you, Luke. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Thanks very much. And I'm on the wrong side already. Gosh, I'm not doing very well, am I? Hopefully that will take us back in just a moment. Maybe I'll try that one. Here we go. Right. So first things first, I ought to get the somewhat depressing stuff out of the way. So a bit of a trigger warning in a sense. In my view, at the moment, we are massively letting autistic people down. So I'm always of the opinion that educationalists should spend time in adult services, should go on a secondment, maybe once a year for a week or 10 days or 2 weeks, just to remind ourselves that little people turn into big people. And actually, the journey that you have through school stays with you for the rest of your life. And I'm going to be talking about some of the kind of more sort of broader conceptual side of things, as far as I'm concerned, that relate to autism and the lived experience of autistic children that subsequently lead on to the lived experience of the autistic adult. Things like understanding life through the autism lens, and the concept that actually education, if we get it wrong, and sometimes you only need to get it slightly wrong, can cause long-term post-traumatic stress disorder, long-term anxiety, that lead to all sorts of major difficulties, including, we know that autistic people die younger than they should compared to the predominant neurotype, the rest of the population. We know that suicide and suicide ideation is way, way higher than it should be, again, compared to the predominant neurotype. So clearly we're getting something wrong. Not everybody, I'm sure there are loads of people listening to this are getting it absolutely right, which is fantastic. But in the main, I still feel that we're getting something massively wrong. So rather than, I know my title is what does or should autistic inclusion even mean to the autistic learner? One of the things that frustrates me is why, when we talk about inclusion, why are we not talking about autistic quality of life as an absolute paramount forefront concept that should come before anything else at all? I say this so frequently to parents. You're far better off having a happy autistic child who doesn't do well at school than a traumatized child who is forced into doing things in a way that suits other people, who may or may not do better. A traumatized autistic child nobody wants, including the autistic child themselves, trust me. So I think we've got to understand the quality of life, autistic quality of life. And by autistic quality of life, we've got to then subsequently understand that what quality of life means for the autistic individual may, not invariably, but may be qualitatively different compared to their predominant neurotype peers. So inclusion can't be the same, can't look exactly the same for everybody, because if it does, we're probably getting it wrong. Real life examples. I'm gonna have to keep an eye on the old time here as well. So I don't know if this is an appropriate, well, no, it's appropriate because it's true. So these are just real life examples of where I think we've got it wrong in relation to autistic inclusion. So the first one was, they're all my examples, but all examples of children that I've been involved in for whatever way, for whatever reason. This first one, excuse me, miss, why are you still so fat? Which, by the way, was a title of a presentation I did to a whole bunch of Senkos once. So I thought a great title for a presentation, but it's not today's title, it's just part of a slide. And these were verbatim words uttered by an autistic child to his teacher, and subsequently he was up for exclusion. And I was on the, I was part of the meeting, the advisory panel to decide how much punishment this child should have. And I was there kind of advocating on behalf of the child. And I'd done my homework, or I felt I'd done my homework. And I won't go through, I won't bore you with the details, but trust me, it's a very awkward situation where the woman in question is sitting in the same room, and you have to sort of say, you know, on behalf of the child, did he have a point? Very awkward indeed. Something that nobody kind of tells you what to do in those sorts of social situations. But the whole point was, so breaking it down and understanding life through the autism lens. So this is one of the concepts that I think is absolutely essential, that there's more than one side to every story. And certainly when it comes to autism, if we have a poor understanding of what life is like through the autism lens, then we're highly likely to misunderstand where the child is coming from, and subsequently then do act potentially in the wrong way, which is highly exclusionary as opposed to inclusionary. So she had this, I'd gone to see this child and I'd had all of the evidence there. And she'd given, this teacher had given a lesson, and it was all about health and nutrition. And she said, look, to the class, she said, look, I am overweight, I'm fat, and I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to go on a diet, and I'm going to start exercising, and within a few weeks you will see a difference in my physical shape. And for whatever reason, either she didn't do it or it hadn't worked or whatever, she didn't lose any weight. And so he approached her and very politely, as politely as you can in terms of the question you asked her, excuse me, miss, but why are you still so fat? And I remember talking to him. I went over to his house to try and work out what was going on. And he was literally in tears, because he was saying, Miss always tells us that if we don't understand something that she's teaching us, we should ask her for an explanation. She told us she was going to change her body shape and she didn't. And so I was confused. And She tells us at the beginning of the year and reiterates it throughout the year, if I'm not making sense to you, please come and ask. So all I was doing as I'd been asked. And I was there in this tribunal essentially. And I said, did anybody else in the class come and ask you that question? And she said, no. And I said, well, maybe if you were to understand things in a different way, he's your staff pupil, because he's the only one who's actually come and done as you've taught him to do. So I thought the end of the story was he didn't get excluded and I was never invited back to that school. But anyway, win some, you lose some. So there's loads more I could go on about that, but I've got other examples as well. Handwriting skills. You can't throw things at me because you're not here. This is virtual, so I can be confident in saying things like, handwriting is not the skill that we used to feel was worthy. We don't need to write anywhere near as much as we used to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because most people type. And this app, so this is a real life example of somebody who was basically forced into writing. And it's like, that's what everybody else does, and you've got to write neatly. Now, I often say this to teaching staff in terms of the Equality Act. If you are an autistic child and you've got proprioceptive difficulties, so fine motor coordination difficulties, and you find it difficult to hold a pen, so many autistic children find it really difficult to hold a pen comfortably and subsequently write. So often, and particularly in this case, this child, it was actually quite painful for him to write, and it would take him 2 or 3 times longer to write a sentence compared to everybody else, and his handwriting subsequently was almost illegible. So he had incredibly poor self-esteem, and he was essentially being punished for being autistic and having proprioceptive dysfunction. So that is not inclusion. Doing everything the same way and saying, no, you've got to, as opposed to it'd be difficult for me to get through this example without crying, because it's so cool. And I'm not saying this is a way forward for everybody, because it's not possible, but one of the best examples of inclusion was in a class, and it was going towards GCSEs, and a young lady similar to this, and she found it very difficult to write, so she was given a laptop, and school said, you can use a laptop, but she was also one of these autistic people who hated standing out or being in the spotlight. Said, I don't want to be the only person to use a laptop. So they bought the entire year group laptops and said, there you go, everybody can have the choice to use laptops or to write. And all of a sudden, she wasn't the one standing out, but she had her needs met. Such a gorgeous example of inclusion. Wearing a tie, this was an example of somebody we all know, well, I guess we all know about sensory sensitivities and hyper sensitive, particularly in terms of tactility. So this guy, literally, if he wore a tie, he felt like he was being strangled. He was being forced to go to school while being asphyxiated. And if you think that's bad, the next example is just as awful. You must eat in the canteen like everybody else. Again, the school genuinely thought they were being inclusive as opposed to being integrative, which is a completely different thing. So treating everybody the same and integrating the autistic child in with everybody else. However, this child, again, from a sensory perspective, in terms of the olfactory overwhelm, the auditory overwhelm, etc., could not eat, literally could not eat. So this child was being starved at school as a direct result of their inclusion policy. There you go. Now, I haven't actually really started my presentation yet, but okay. Yes, need to keep a close eye on time. So, okay. Yeah, no, I can't. I wanted to go off at a tangent. Anyway, never mind. Right. So common mistakes, inclusion, understand within the context of integration. So, i.e., just squeezing a kid in with everybody else, all of a sudden that's inclusive. Not necessarily. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's not synonymous with inclusion. Treating everybody the same. Definitely not inclusion. Making assumptions all autistic pupils have the same requirements. It is terrifying for a parent to go into school and the school response to their autistic child coming to the school saying, it's okay, we know how to teach, we know how to teach her because we had a kid last year who was autistic. And making that assumption that what worked last year for that kid is going to be the same for your child. Complete nonsense. Not taking autistic masking into account. This is a 2-hour presentation in its own right, but that social camouflaging, masking, and what you see is not what you get. So sometimes an autistic child can mask, i.e. copy that kind of echopraxic behavior, copying of other people, and you've no idea what's going on behind the scenes. And then assuming that predominant neurotype or non-autistic children goals are as beneficial or even meaningful for those autistic pupils, we have to recognize that being autistic is by definition being different, and therefore processing things in a different way and sometimes having different goals. Just some terms. So I can't bear the fact that we still other autistic people as lesser human beings. And I don't say that lightly. So Catherine was talking earlier about terms, and Emily was also talking earlier, referring to language and what have you. Language is absolutely critical. Imagine, oh no, I haven't got time to go through that. I went through, I put a plea out on Twitter saying, can we please, during Autism Awareness Weeks, take down all the posters, the heading of which say autistic spectrum disorder. You are literally just pushing it in the face of all of those autistic children who walk past that poster, who are reading it. You're telling those children that they are disordered human beings. That's not inclusive, and that's not going to do a lot for your self-esteem. Anyway, school refuser, absolutely revolting expression. I've put anxiety-induced preservation as potential alternative to being a school refuser. If you are that anxious to go to school, and you are literally preserving yourself by not leaving the house, that's a far better way of understanding where that child is coming from, as opposed to putting the onus on them saying, you are a school refuser. Challenging behaviour, get rid of that altogether, and introduce the term distressed behaviour instead. Autopia is my term for autistic utopia, which is my vision for the future, which is kind of what I wanted to talk about, but I'm going to run out of time. So some essential equations for inclusive understanding. What I, my self-proclaimed golden equation, awesome plus environment equals outcome. Awesome does not automatically mean anything. The outcome for the individual has to be a combination of awesome plus the environment. So if the outcome is anxiety or distress or something negative, and we accept you can't change somebody being autistic, which you can't, nor should you want to, the only thing left to change is the environment, i.e. usually us. It might be the physical environment from a sensory perspective, whatever it might be, but the focus should be away from the child and more to do with the environment if we want to change the outcome. The fewer options there are equals the greater risk of exclusive practice. So we need a whole plethora of options. So there was a question to Catherine earlier around, what should we increase the types of being educated? Absolutely, we should have a huge number of different ways of educating. Why are we not going down to the river? Why are we not teaching in yurts? Why are we not, teaching more in forests or whatever? And basically, the narrower the options there are, the greater risk of exclusive practice. And then being autistic equals the increased chance of needing differing approaches. Doesn't mean to say you're automatically going to need different approaches, but there's a much greater increased chance of needing them. And of course, if we don't then provide them, then we're getting closer and closer and closer to not meeting the Equality Act and acting unlawfully, which then has an impact, obviously, on the child. So autistic inclusion has to be based on autistic quality of life, and that's got to be on a person by person, child by child basis, rather than just taking awesome as a broad term that's meaningful in and of its own right. It has to be done on an individual basis. Non-pejorative language. Oh, by the way, there's a fantastic quotation from Gunilla Gerland. An autistic person can be of many ages. Absolute genius. So just understand, in fact, it does relate to the very last bullet point here, in terms of understanding the spiky profile of the autistic learner, being super good at certain things and finding difficulties in other areas. But again, this concept of going back to Gunilla Gerland's, an autistic person can be of many ages, I think that just sums it up in such a gorgeous fashion, that you can have the sort of 60-year-old head in one area, but then maybe a 5-year-old head in another. And I think that's gorgeous, and that kind of embracing of those sorts of individuals as part and part of natural humanity, which is what being autistic is. We've got a lot of this is very difficult to implement. Non-pejorative language is not difficult to implement. We can just get rid of it tomorrow. We can say, right, when we go back to school tomorrow, we're just going to get rid of disorder, impairment, all of those things that we use in relation to autism. I was given oh God, this will make me cry as well, but a 16-year-old who was leaving to go into do her A-levels elsewhere, and she wrote as part of her, it was actually part of her one of her core subjects, she basically wrote a short book about her life at school, that she wanted to leave as her legacy to the teaching staff, to say, don't ever let another autistic person go through what I've been through. Every day of my life, I have to hear kids in the playground using the term autism as a negative term. Oh, you can't talk properly, you must be autistic. You're stupid, you must be autistic. Just as an autistic person myself, that has damaged me forever. Autistic inclusion has got to be meaningful to the individual, got to include reference to a full sensory profile. If we're not taking autistic children's sensory profile into account, it's highly likely that we're going to be edging towards that exclusive practice. And of course, autistic children themselves don't necessarily know what their sensory needs are. So if you're forcing, the noise of the school bell is one that I've got such a bugbear about, and also corridor crush. Here's one for you. Why do we not get rid of corridor crushes so we've got quiet time to transition between lessons? If you are tactile hypersensitive and light touch makes you is the equivalent of being punched, which it is for so many autistic children, corridor crush is being physically abused every time you go from A to B. Every single day of your life, every single day you go to school, you know you're going to be physically abused, and those are the sorts of things that lead to long-term trauma. Relates to autistic communication and autistic sociality. So we recognise that autistic communication might differ from one individual to the next, and that autistic sociality is real. My very last slide, because I do want to finish vaguely on time. This is Alicia, Australian woman, amazing writer. The privilege of being oneself is a gift many take for granted, but for someone with autism, being allowed to be oneself is the greatest and rarest gift of all. And that's me.
Thank you very much, Luke. Oh, it makes me just, yay, there's hope for education out there. Thank you very much. So I'm going to introduce now Dr. Kirsten Darling-McQueeston, who's going to have a chat with us about all things inclusion, and lovely to have a Scottish perspective as well, Kirsten. So thank you very much. So I'll hand over to you. Again, please just pop questions in the chat or in the question box.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and thank you everyone else. What a pleasure it is to be here presenting alongside such wonderful presenters. Can I just make sure you can hear and see me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Wonderful. And my slides look like they might be working. Excellent. So I really hope that I can add to the conversation by sharing some insights from the Scottish context in relation to inclusion and inclusive practices. To this end, I'm very much here as a representative of the Scottish Universities Inclusion Group, or SUIG for short. We do love an acronym, don't we? So I'll be sharing some of the work we've been doing as a group to support practitioners in Scotland. But first, I'm going to begin by providing some contextual insights to help set the scene of the work of the group. There we go. So I'm going to begin this presentation by sharing a little of the legal and policy context in Scotland. And I realise some of you might have a more in-depth knowledge of this context than I do, so apologies in advance to you. But for those of you that are perhaps less familiar, I hope that this will be insightful and really kind of frame the rest of the presentation. So here we go. Wonderful. Oh, I've gone on too many. Apologies. There we go. Overzealous. So I've tried to briefly capture the most significant aspects of the legal and policy context in relation to Scottish education and the drive for inclusion. This slide picks up in the year 2000 on the left-hand side as you look at the screen with the Standards in Scotland School Act. And this reflects the international drive for inclusion stemming from the Salamanca Statement to ensure that schools accommodate all children, regardless of physical, intellectual, social, emotional, linguistic, or other needs, or should we say rights. I will not go through each of these acts or policy frameworks captured in the slide in detail, but I do want to highlight some of the most significant features of the landscape. For example, the Education Additional Support for Learning Scotland Act 2004. This act brought about a significant change in language and in turn practice in Scotland. It replaced the term special educational needs with additional support needs, ASN. Additional support needs is a broader term which not only includes children and young people with physical and/or learning difficulties, but also children whose educational progress is limited by their social circumstances. Furthermore, it reflects the sometimes transient and far-reaching nature of needs. In other words, there's an understanding that we may all have needs at some point. These may be temporary, permanent, or ever-changing. I'll also draw your attention to the Getting It Right for Every Child policy. It goes by the snappy acronym of GERFIC. So if you want to come up to Scotland, if you just say GERFIC every now and again, no one will notice. Getting It Right for Every Child is often described as a landmark children's policy framework. It's been put in place to improve children's well-being via early intervention, universal service provision, and multi-agency working. It's somewhat of a bedrock of the Scottish policy landscape, and as such, pre-existing acts have been amended to reflect the language and intentions of GERFIC, along with the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, for which there is now an implementation bill. We could say that this legal and policy landscape creates a conducive context for inclusive education system and national curriculum. It is indeed the case that some aspects of the national curriculum in Scotland, our national curriculum framework rather, the Curriculum for Excellence, reflects this legal and policy landscape. The inclusive, flexible, and ambitious philosophy that drove the inception of Curriculum for Excellence has been widely credited, most recently by the OECD, who stated in their recent 2021 report, Curriculum for Excellence vision to achieve excellence for all students is widely shared by stakeholders and continues to be an inspiring example. On the other hand, however, the Curriculum for Excellence has been widely critiqued, including by Mark Priestley and Walter Humes, for being confused and confusing, a mixed up curriculum that lacks the coherent structure needed to live up to the flexible progressive vision that had the potential to support the flourishing of all children and young people. It is therefore fair to say that enactment of a Curriculum for Excellence in practice has been challenging, particularly in relation to the core values such as social justice and inclusion. Some of these challenges and indeed opportunities were captured in a recent independent review of additional support needs, which I'll share some insights from. Now, as has been well established in research literature on inclusion, teachers and teacher attitudes are of great importance. Lani Florian, Christine Black-Hawkins, Martin Rouse, and many others have found that teachers must believe that they are capable of teaching all learners. The excerpt on the screen from a recent Test Scotland report is therefore slightly concerning. The article written by Emma Seath reports on the aforementioned independent review of additional support needs in Scotland, headed up by Angela Morgan. Angela Morgan said that some teachers thought they should be teaching children who could achieve in exams and were upfront about that. Other teachers, meanwhile, had become cynical because they once believed in inclusion but hadn't seen it being delivered in practice and had lost heart. The whole concept of inclusion is not fully embraced. There's not belief that mainstreaming or inclusion of children is something that should be done. The perspectives of the teachers captured here, which I share for you to highlight the issues in the system, not as criticisms of these individual teachers, but they suggest there are challenges in translating the policies designed to be inclusive into practice within the Scottish context. However, what should also be noted is that inclusive approaches are possible. Arguably less of a headline, but the same review also found that nationally, there are outstanding examples of mainstream education settings that have stretched and adapted their culture and environments to benefit all children and young people. While such examples are heartening and encouraging, it is clear that there's work to be done. So what are we doing to support our teachers and practitioners to enact inclusive approaches in practice? So here we have get to the point of the presentation, the National Framework for Inclusion. The first edition of the National Framework of Inclusion was first developed in 2009 by the Scottish Teacher Education Committee. This is the same committee that is now known as SUIG, the Scottish Universities Inclusion Group. A second edition was released in 2014, and work on the third edition is well underway. The National Framework for Inclusion is developed in line with updates made to the National Teaching Standards. In essence, the National Framework for Inclusion was designed to support teachers at all stages of their careers to make decisions about how to enact contemporary understandings of inclusion. The framework is posited on values and beliefs, specifically those of social justice, inclusion, and learning and teaching issues, and how they relate to legislation and policy. The decision to take a values-based approach reflects contemporary research into inclusion and inclusive practices, particularly the research by Lanny Florian, Christine Black-Hawkins on inclusive pedagogy, which strongly influences the framework. The framework is therefore designed to designed to provide answers or guidelines. Do this to be inclusive, do that to be inclusive. No. Instead, it appreciates the complexity of practice, so supports teachers by encouraging them to reflect on and think critically about their practice in terms of inclusion and inclusive approaches. The framework itself has been designed to complement the professional teaching standards, which all teachers in Scotland need to be signed off against every 5 years. The following slide shows an excerpt from the newly refreshed General Teaching Council's for Scotland professional standards for our student teachers, alongside which I've included some of the questions we are currently developing for the third edition of the framework. The third edition is currently under review by a wide variety of critical partners, so we're inviting you into that critical conversation today. So the questions are still in draft form, but hopefully give an insight into the purpose of the National Framework for Inclusion. So here we are. The 4 questions that I've included on this slide in the green squares along the bottom are illustrative of the nature of the questions that make up the National Framework for Inclusion. These questions relate directly to the teaching standards in order to bring inclusion and inclusive approaches more sharply into focus. For example, the teaching standards ask that our student teachers have knowledge and understanding of pedagogical and learning theories and use these to inform a number of aspects of their practice, including curriculum design, planning, teaching and assessment, interdisciplinary learning, and additional support needs. So the framework prompts critical reflection by asking, what pedagogical theories, practices do I rely on? In what ways do these theories and practices promote or hinder inclusive approaches? How do pedagogical learning theories and assessment promote learners' capacity to learn? How do interdisciplinary approaches to learning enhance participation for learners? And how do I respond to learner differences in ways that enable all to participate in learning? For myself and colleagues in initial teacher education, the National Framework for Inclusion provides a tool to support us to carefully consider the ways we are supporting our student teachers to be inclusive, to respond to diverse learners, and create learning communities in which children and families can fully participate. Likewise, the framework is also used by in-service teachers, particularly those undertaking master's level study across our universities. So where next? Well, once the 3rd edition of the National Framework for Inclusion is released and available, hopefully by the start of the next academic year, we'll be really interested in exploring the possible impact that it has on our student teachers and our in-service teachers. And it's not captured here on the slide, but what's really important to us is understanding what the impact is on the children and families who the teachers are working with and for. So we're really interested in exploring more of the Scottish context, what we are really doing in terms of inclusion and being inclusive. Thank you so much for listening. I'm really looking forward to everyone's questions in the question and answer session later on.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. It's really interesting to see what that looks like in Scotland as well, and particularly how that's linked to ITE, which is always important for our trainee teachers. Okay, so we are just going to have a little bit of time now then to have some questions. So there have been some that have been asked, and I'm just going to ask the panel if they wouldn't mind unmuting. And if we can just have your thoughts and opinions on a question that's come from Sarah, which is, how have you found the increasing Ofsted focus on the broader curriculum has impacted access to a broad range of curricular learning for your children with SEND? Does teacher confidence in universal, targeted and specialist approaches vary across the subjects in primary? And does intervention disproportionately affect learners with SEND access to non-core curriculum subjects? So, who would like to have a go?
I'm happy to come in to start off on that one. I think it's a real risk. I think it's something we have to be very careful about in terms of, again, I'm reflecting, there was so much in Catherine's presentation that speaks to this about the narrowing of particular aspects of the system that we work within, which means that certain things are measured, and of course what is measured is valued, and therefore we can get ourselves really caught up in a cycle whereby actually our learners with SEND end up having a very, very narrowed experience. And again, going back to that point about preparation for adulthood, well, that's us doing them a real disservice. And I think there is also a risk that we just try and do more, try and expect more from everybody in the system. And I'm very aware that, you know, there's overwhelm in the system, and that overwhelm can also then be projected onto our learners, and we have a real duty to protect them against that. And I think, you know, what sort of the conversations that I have with the leaders that I work with the SENCos, with the teachers that I work with, is trying to really think about, well, actually, how can we use this conversation about broadly balanced curriculum to our advantage? How can we flip it? And how can we think about using the knowledge of our learners and the knowledge of their strengths and their interests? And I was really interested to hear Catherine talk about her son and the love of gardening and how that was brought in, to think about actually how do we support those overarching objectives that we need to ensure we give our learners with SEND lots of opportunities to access, to make progress against within those broader curriculum subjects, so that we're not narrowing down. And the example that I gave in my presentation about identifying a couple of overarching objectives that then fed into all of our planning. In our schools, we use an integrated approach. So actually those overarching objectives were being brought into all of the subjects across the whole entire curriculum. So they were still accessing the geography, they were still accessing the history within the topic, but they were having opportunities to have experiences of success, to have experiences that they need in order to go on their learning journey in a way that also meant that they were not being taken out of those other subjects, and that they were still being exposed to that. Now that's I think it's really complex, but I think there are real tensions within the system. But I think we need to name those tensions, we need to keep on talking about them, we need to keep on reflecting on them, and ensure that we're constantly challenging ourselves around that.
Colin, I think you're on mute.
Obviously, Ofsted doesn't apply to us here in Northern Ireland, but I think we share similar pressures on our mainstream colleagues that they have targets to jump to. They are constrained in what they can do and can't do. And that was the point I was making, that inclusion does not mean just getting everybody together in the one place all together. And in Northern Ireland, our special schools sector is very strong, and we deliver a curriculum that provides the children with the education that they need for independent life and so forth. But the additional needs is a spectrum. There are those children who would be able to be in mainstream classrooms with their additional needs, but they're not being met yet because our mainstream colleagues are not being given the chance to broaden our curriculum because of targets set by government and the focus on O levels, A levels, GCSEs. This is what they're worried about. Our mainstream colleagues have a hard battle. They would love to be delivering a broad and balanced curriculum that me and the special sector has the freedom to do and make the difference. So I think it's, I think it's about teachers working together in both sectors and not this dichotomy of special against mainstream, mainstream against special. Every child with additional needs to be met, whatever the provision is. But at the moment, our government, our policymakers are driving a different agenda, and that is having a negative impact on those children with additional needs who could be showing so much more and living to their potential. And that is my worry as an educator here in Northern Ireland, that we need to seriously sit down and look at this and start again.
I absolutely echo what Colin said, and just quickly, it's perhaps another, I was going to say hour, probably another year, talking about Ofsted. Certainly from an autism perspective, Ofsted's just not fit for purpose in terms of understanding what good education actually looks like. So, I've been involved in so many schools where Ofsted has come in and said, "Oh no, why are those kids doing?" And he's like, "No, this is good practice, not, if you don't understand why these kids are engaging or disengaging in the way that they are, and then you're making judgments based on a non-autistic norm, you're going to get it wrong." And then that puts pressure on schools, and you end up with these horrendous situations that we all know about, where parents said, "Oh, do you mind if your kids don't come to school on site?" Oh, that absolute othering and that vile. But the pressure is on. It goes back to what Catherine's saying about league tables and all of those sorts of things. So, and reflecting on what Colin said, we've got it fundamentally wrong right at the heart. Sorry if anybody's in government, by the way.
I think it's good we hear all voices, and that's the whole point, isn't it, is bringing these voices together to look at what works, what doesn't, what can we change, what can we do to support all of our learners. Thank you so much for your input there. I've got another question here from Derek, which is what would your ideal initial teacher training program curriculum contain? Which, as an IT provider myself, is the one where I think about this all the time. Kirsten, do you want to start us off with that one?
Wow, that's a really good question. Yeah. So I think, well, the first thing I'd probably say is, and there can be a nice conversation around this, which is great, is I would call it initial teacher education. I think that's really important. I think training doesn't capture the complexity of the demand on our student teachers and the complexity of the job, and aspiring to meet the needs of a diverse range of learners and their families. So I'm a real advocate for initial teacher education. What would it contain? I think inclusive approaches, diversity, equity, equality, all those good terms need to be at the core of this, the initial teacher education for every student teacher. It's not something that's an add-on, it's not an additional, it's not a separate course, which some people elect to do. It's very much at the core and woven through. So this is something that we're working hard to try and do. We have our sort of professional study sessions, if you like, with our students, but how do we make sure that those values, and I think it has to be values based, those values and principles permeate through all the curricular inputs and beyond. So that would be my tuppence worth on that, but I'll be thinking about that question all night. Thank you.
I think that's so important, and actually thinking about something Luke said as well. I know for our course, one of the big things, because I lead SEND in diversity and inclusion and global citizenship, was for me, it was thinking about behaviour management as well. You know, this behaviour management that we have to talk about all the time in teacher education, and actually thinking about, you know, why are those behaviours, you know, apparent? You know, why does that behaviour look like that? Or what are they actually trying to tell you? You know, what are the reasons behind the way that people are acting, and how we build relationships with our pupils in class, actually get to know them and why they feel that way, and have that safe space.
Victoria, if I could say that I'm
Yeah.
a great believer in ITT, initial teacher training, as we call it here in Northern Ireland. But I do agree with Kirsten, it is an education they're getting, not just training. But I feel we have 2 teacher training colleges in Northern Ireland, and I would be one of their assessors for them. And I do notice the change in the profile of classrooms in Northern Ireland. I'm sure it's echoed throughout the rest of the UK. More and more children who would have required specialist support or additional support are now not able to access that, or are being returned to mainstream classrooms. So our mainstream teachers are being faced with a wider diversity of students in front of them. And I think our teacher training colleges need to step back and regroup their training, because they're practicing a program 10, 15 years ago that they were doing. Our students or teachers are coming out, they don't know what they're doing with the child with dyslexia, ADD, whatever. Because as Kirsten said, the program here is year 4 students can pick an elective to do 6 weeks in a special school or special unit, and that's it. Whereas I feel the provision should start in year 1, and it should be part and parcel of literacy, numeracy, all the other subjects they're taught, whether they're primary, post-primary. And so when they go out, these young teachers have got a toolbox of understanding and knowledge to at least recognize the pupils in their classroom and start to help them while they gain more experience or get more expertise in. But our ITTs are failing student teachers at the moment because they're not preparing them for the classroom environment that they're moving into in this year or the years ahead. And I'm a firm believer in, you know, get the students more aware of additional needs and approaches, because some of the approaches we use in additional needs actually would benefit children who don't have the additional needs. Yeah. And it's good, solid practice, but it's always seen as, well, that's what you do with children who can't learn. But actually, we do it and our children do learn, and it would help all learners. But I do think a teacher training is a core point we need to get right. So our young teachers coming out are prepared with the knowledge and the experience to deal with the diversity of students and provide the best education. And that's my 2 pence worth. You know, sorry.
I think it's very valid. I mean, if a student goes in their first year and their first, you know, thought and the main thing in their head isn't how do I make everybody here feel like they belong and they're welcome, then I don't really know what the point is personally. You know, why are we there? Just a couple of other questions, if possible. We've got 3 minutes. This one is to Kirsten again. So the rephrase of special needs to additional needs is great. What is the consensus of a rephrase of the term special? My research with young adults with autism is that they don't refer to themselves as special needs. That's from Christina, probably for Luke as well there.
Yeah, I would say it's been widely accepted. It's been in play for a while now, and it's generally seen as being more inclusive, but I think we probably still need to work on the needs part. Additional support rights, I don't know. Luke, what do you think?
I can only sort of speak from an autism perspective. I don't think I had a media piece once, and I got so many complaints about it. But it was basically saying, look, if somebody tells you they're autistic, that doesn't tell you anything at all, apart from the fact that they're autistic. That literally doesn't tell you. It drives people mad if you say, oh, I'm autistic, and they go, oh yeah, you must be X, Y, and Z, or you can't do this. It's like, no, it's just like, you know, absolutely bonkers. So being autistic doesn't mean you have any particular needs necessarily, but it might mean you have a whole host of support requirements. So, and so I think I'm an absolute language nerd. I'm obsessed with it. My poor students, it drives them nuts. It's like, no, you don't mean that word, you mean this, or whatever it might be. But for autistic people, it's hugely important. Like it makes a big difference. So I would just, while I'm allowed to talk, what I would say is like, let's just acknowledge teachers are pretty cool. Yeah, like we seem to be having a bit of a go. Well, I spend a lot of time having to go at teachers, but going back to the initial teacher training, we've got to actually get the training or the education correct? Like it amazes me the number of students that come on my course who are Senkos or teachers or speech and language therapists say, oh, well, in our training, we were told X, Y, and Z, and you're saying that this is complete, I'm about to swear then, the opposite of accurate. Whatever. It's like this is people are still selling myths. It's like, you know, autistic people lack empathy, all this complete crap. And they're being taught this on a day-to-day basis in our clinical disciplines and in education. We've got to get it right.
Can I just add as well, I just think it's so important. So I'm building on what you're just saying there, Luke. I just think it's so important that we recognise that as teachers, we have to be learners as well. I was just thinking what you were saying, Kirsten, about, you know, education and actually we've got to be open to being challenged. You know, there's sort of this notion, I was just thinking what you were just saying, Luke, was like, well, this is what we were told. Well, if we're told that, but it doesn't make sense, or there's a disconnect with what we're experiencing in the classroom, well, let's challenge it and let's actually be curious, let's notice, let's reframe. And I think we've got to get that message that actually first and foremost as teachers, we're learners.
Yeah, and I think too, teachers go into the profession because they want to make a difference in a child's life. Mm-hmm. And they need to be given the tools, the knowledge, this experience from teacher training colleges, from a government, from policymakers to make that difference. And that's where we need to be focusing, not so much on the actual teachers, but on the support mechanisms around them to give them what they need to go in, to understand their children better, to know about every child and to make that difference. And I think that's where we have to flip it, as opposed to the results being led, it should be child-led.
Thank you all so very, very much. We are all going to leave now and go back into the main session where we have kind of a little bit of a plenary and a roundup, and I'll see you back in there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think we should get underway because we've got the sessions to go through and give everyone plenty of time. My name is Richard Pountney and I'm the chair of the parallel session. Our running order for this session is first Margaret Mulholland, followed by Amelia Roberts, then Janet Hoskin, and finally Chandrika Devarakonda. Could just note everybody that we're going to run through the 4 sessions and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions. So I'll now pass on to Margaret and for the first talk.
Lovely, thank you. Afternoon, everybody. Lovely to be here. I'm going to talk a bit today about SEND and the art of detection. It stems from an article I wrote in 2018 for the journal The Professional from the Chartered College of Teaching. And it really, I suppose, is thinking about inclusivity and its relevance to young people with special educational needs. And many of the things that Catherine touched on already this afternoon, I think are highlighted in this notion that by putting SEN learners at the centre of our thinking, we get to know those learners better as individuals and we can understand their learning needs more effectively. And so really the art of formative assessment, the art of inquiry, I liken to the role of a detective, and that the more forensic we are about our inquiry, the better we understand the learner in front of us and not their labels. So a real notion around how inquiry drives that sense of belonging, that sense of understanding, and that capacity to engage and access the curriculum. Rather than just thinking about that inquiry process, that graduated approach, which I'll touch on throughout this session, which I think is so important, that assess, plan, do, review for teachers in terms of their effective teaching, their quality first teaching. I'm also going to think about the dilemmas that have really frustrated me, I think, since 2018. The notion of how we frame that inquiry process, how we get to know young people, and how we put that within a much bigger holistic picture of pedagogy. I'm also a parent of a young person with special educational needs. And the most frustrating thing I've experienced was it used to be talked about SEND provision. And when I was at school, I would say, What frustrates me is that provision often neglects pedagogy. It stops thinking of my child as a learner. And I felt that that was one of the things that sometimes we don't do very effectively, is think about what are the learning needs and how do we reskill teachers, and I'll explain what I mean by that, to feel that they can meet the needs of a child that they've perhaps not met before, or not researched their autism or their dyslexia, etc., but really start to understand that child in front of them. And I'd really like to think about this. I'd really like to understand where this fits in a holistic way. Catherine talked about systemic exclusion, or what Rob Webster calls in his new book that's coming out in the summer, structural exclusion. That intention of people to include learners who struggle. But actually, in those schools, often what we see is the illusion of inclusion, that separation and segregation, an unintended consequence of supporting young people with additional needs to actually learn separately, to do differently, to dumb down in some instances. So that pedagogy, where does it fit? And I really, in my role at ASCL, the Association of School and College Leaders, we're often trying to influence DFE policy. And I think one of the most frustrating things is the siloed nature of policy making. And actually, what I think we have at the moment is a very strong focus on knowledge within the early career framework, the MPQs, but actually we need a fuller holistic picture to understand that just by adding new knowledge into the system, even if that knowledge is deeper around SEND, and I wish that that was the case, but actually we need to think about what's the interrelationships of not just a knowledge-rich focus on the needs of learners with special educational needs and their curriculum access, but actually what else needs to be in that picture. And for me, this work by Linda Darling-Hammond, I'm a big fan of Linda Darling-Hammond and the Learning Policy Institute, really helps to articulate what I think is neglected and often missing, which is the training and development of teachers around dispositions and skills. I think we're doing better in terms of the knowledge we need to teach children effectively, to develop quality first teaching, but actually we're not clear, and Catherine has really communicated this well, I think, we're not clear about what the vision is, what inclusivity means in our school. Working on an EEF project at the moment, and often I'll find that the head teacher's perception of inclusivity at that school is different from that of the SENCO, and different again from the head of English or the Year 4 teacher. And we really need that shared endeavour around how we best support learners with special educational needs. And we need to move away from that notion of labels and much more focus and intentionality, if you like, on understanding the cognitive profiles and the needs of these young people as learners. So I'm going to focus there and I'll just give you a chance to sort of zoom in on that, around that notion of inquiry, but also around adaptive expertise and that interplay with dispositions, that notion of equity, and I stress equity rather than equality. So dispositions, that notion of inclusive pedagogy. When I was working in a special school for the 8 years, I was really taken with the notion that the practitioners in the school really embodied some of the research findings from Learning Without Limits and Sue Hart around working with young people with learning difficulties, the co-agency that they gave those young people, the importance they placed on relationships and trust, and most importantly, that notion of transformability, that notion that actually there was no ceiling on the capacities of this young person, that actually they were open to surprise, and that notion of co-occurrence of needs often makes it, and I know this from my own experience, very difficult to understand the learning capacities of the young people in front of you. So remaining constantly open and mindful that you want to be surprised by their ability to engage with the curriculum in front of them and to engage with the learning opportunities and to build on those strengths that you can unpick and develop through these relationships and these opportunities for excelling. And those notions, I was fascinated working with the Institute of Education on the work around Florian and Black, Christine Black Hawkins and Lani Florian, and that notion of mindset and how important it goes back to the Learning Policy Institute framework, conceptualized as, you know, this capacity to move beyond this notion of most and some. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this work, this sort of, you know, majority, we're teaching, we're developing, we're learning, designing the curriculum around the majority of pupils, and then we're doing something slightly different for those who are struggling. And we need to flip that narrative, as Ellie Chappell would say, and really start, I think, with those learners who struggle, because actually, you know, by addressing the challenges they face, inclusion can follow. And, you know, we say, don't we, what's valuable for all is vital for some. And I think we start with those learners who are going to feel most challenged when we're planning and designing the curriculum and put their needs first. Then actually we can really reach far more young people who at all times through their lived experience at school may struggle to learn. And thank you. And this allows us through, I think, this sort of dispositions and mindsets is to think about labels, as Catherine said, not as unhelpful, but actually as a start point. You know, they're an indicator of possible challenges, possible strengths, possible profile, but actually each child with autism is different, each child with dyslexia is different. So that condition specific label is unhelpful in the main. And so we need to, I think, and I talked before about reskilling teachers. We've de-skilled teachers with the notion that specialism to teach SEND is something that only the SENCO has in their setting, and that actually they haven't yet engaged with how to teach a young person who has complex learning difficulties. We need to challenge that assumption, and we need to challenge the assumption of labels, and instead shift our focus through inquiry, through being curious about young people, through assessment for learning. We need to think about assessment, not assumptions, which Mark Rowland very eloquently talks about when he's talking about pupil premium children and how we identify, you know, not with that label, but with the individual and their needs, a strengths-based approach. So I think the inquiry process drives this move beyond labels. And this is where this notion of, you know, the methodology of being a detective, being curious, being forensic, being empowered by using a graduated approach. And that provides us with the evidence that we need when teaching. You know, the teacher becomes the learner. And when we're using an inquiry approach, and I love the spiral of inquiry from Helen Timperley and colleagues, that notion of really learning to notice, learning to look at micro changes in behavior and say, what's that telling me about this child in front of me? Never assuming that you've understood the full capacity of that child. That notion of the detective looking at, you know, the form of communication that is a struggling learner in the classroom, and being able to look more deeply and test through the notion of what it is that's forming a barrier to their learning. And just this notion of assess, plan, do, review, I think Kate Browning at Mason, she's still got an old video that articulates so brilliantly that notion that we use assess, plan, do, review as teachers every day. You know, we shape our lesson planning around that assessment feedback. But when we have a child who's struggling, then we move tighter around that profile. And I'm just going to, and can you move me on again? Thanks. So we become the learner of the students in front of us. And that provides us with this opportunity to reflect. That's also part of those dispositions. And I think that notion of how we adapt curriculum is through the formative assessment cycle, through the assess, plan, do, review. And my real concern is that often in schools at the moment, we still use that assess, plan, do, review, that graduated approach as something aligned to when a child is struggling and is going to be identified as needing an education healthcare plan or going on to SEND action, when actually this is the cycle that teachers are using every day. So re-empowering them not to worry about labels, not to worry about graduated approaches, something SEND specific, but actually to use the expertise of that learner in front of them, being the learner about that child. They are the expert, not the SENCO on the child in year 4 that they are the teacher for. They are the geography expert when they're teaching their year 9 class. And we need to re-empower that narrative. So really using that notion of dispositions of equity, notion of having trust and faith in the learner in front of you to learn, feeling like you can, as a teacher, teach everybody are the core dispositions there, I think. And then that knowledge of the learner being something you build and develop through skill development of adaptive expertise. So I also wanted to throw in there the notion, I've only got 2 minutes, of soldier. And the reason I put that in there, and I was horrified by this title when I wrote the article in TES, that there was Margaret Mulholland likens teaching to soldiers in battle. What I actually meant was this notion of novice to expert is not a helpful one. Actually, when we think about young people with so many learning differences, we need to teach from the outset the importance of adaptive expertise. And soldiers in battle, as a piece of research by the MOD, cognitive psychology research, is fascinating, which says we can't develop routines for the first 2 years of a soldier's development because they'll lose their lives in battle. And the same thing is true in the classroom, that actually we need to teach innovation and adaptation from day 1 of a teacher's career if they're going to meet confidently the needs of the learners in front of them. And if we can move on to the next one, I'm going to go right through to thinking like a detective. And this was a later article that I wrote, and I thought again it was fascinating that we came back to that notion of detective in the meta learning, that developing metacognitive skills explicitly in teachers in order that they can use their deductive reasoning and their abductive reasoning when they don't have the full picture, which is often the case with the learner with SEND. You need to give them the skills to use those multiple micro assessments in order to look for patterns in the behaviours of young people and how they learn without jumping to conclusions. So as Farsing, the Norwegian researcher, so beautifully put, we need to be active listeners as teachers, we need to be curious, we need not to label, we need to keep digging and using that notion of inquiry. And in so doing, we can identify how best to help our learners to learn. And in so doing, we can empower teachers to teach everyone and not feel that they cannot teach young people with SEND. And some of those inclusive pedagogies and the notion of adaptive teaching and adaptive expertise are at the core of some new resources that if you haven't engaged with them yet, please do, on the SEND Gateway. The Teacher Handbook, which is a one-hit download, which is fundamentally following the golden thread of the graduated approach through the handbook, and the ITT resources also on the website. So I hope those will prove useful when you go back, I hope, through these slides and have a sort of think about where you are in relation to that conceptual framework, which I hope policymakers will engage with as a more holistic approach to understanding that we need system change, not people and pupil change, if we are really going to enable inclusion and the best outcomes for young people with learning difficulties. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I'm going to move on to Amelia. If there are any questions for Margaret, please post them in the question and answer. Amelia.
Lovely. I'm just going to start my stopwatch so I can stick to time. And if anybody hears a meow in the background, I can assure you that the cat is fine and it is not supper time yet. So Margaret provided me with a fabulous platform, because what I'm going to look at now is how we enable that type of ideology to happen within the to happen within school. I also excuse the very non-snappy title, but what I'm going to do is very, very practical, and we are looking at how we can collaborate with other teachers in respect of supporting young people to really access the curriculum. So, lesson study offers protected time and space for teachers to think and plan together. Crucially, it's about coming together to pick up on Margaret's idea about being a detective around a young person and thinking very clearly about what they're doing in a lesson, and if you like, where they fall off the cliff and also where they don't fall off the cliff. So this is all about providing a structure for teachers to observe, focus young people with or without special educational needs to really understand how they learn and to be curious about the learning process. So why lesson study? The first quote is taken from the UK Lesson Study website, which I thoroughly recommend, and I've taken some screenshots of a handbook that you can download from the website, done by Pete Dudley and colleagues. But lesson study is a powerful professional learning approach that dramatically improves learning and teaching and the practice and subject knowledge of teachers. And another quote that I like very much from Warwick et al. By enabling teachers to work together within an established professional community, lesson study offers the opportunity to gain a more profound understanding of student learning and teachers' own pedagogy. So it's all about joint professional practice. And this is a particularly useful report by Nelson, Spence, Thomas and Taylor, but it's all about, when we think about effective CPD for teachers, when we think around the curriculum, we need to have some really clear objectives, such as thinking about what we want the outcome to be for pupils and how we can support colleagues to think seriously and deeply about their practice. And some of you may have overheard in a corridor a group of couple of staff members say something like, oh no, I've got year 4. Oh no, I've got so-and-so, and we're going to be working on algebra. And the whole point of lesson study is to enable teachers to work collaboratively to solve problems so that valuing can be a really genuine process, and we can move away from conversations that are negative around pupils with special educational needs. So lesson study fits very much into this idea of what really good CPD looks like. So really encouraging deep collaborative learning and making sure that knowledge and skills from both inside and outside school can be accessed, and using collaborative inquiry, not as a quick fix, but to stimulate a learning culture within school. So you have a culture of inquiry and collaboration. Oh, just go backwards. So crucially, lesson study is originated from Japan, and it is tradition in Japan called the research lesson. It's operated quite differently within Japan. Lesson studies can actually be taught in front of quite a big audience. So we've modified it in the UK to generally consist of a team of 3 teachers, sometimes with a knowledgeable other person. Ideally, teachers will have some type of research question in mind, such as what types of strategies will encourage greater dialogue in pair work, or how can we enable the focused children to engage meaningfully in group activities, or what strategies really support writing or time on task. And teachers jointly plan a lesson and generally focus on 3 focused children who are then interviewed at the end of the lesson. So you get some pupil voice as well within the cycle. And the lesson activities are designed to really support and include and interest the focused pupils, who generally are pupils with special educational needs. There is a rather nice framework that I'll show you. And it's about getting teachers to predict how the focused children will react and respond to particular activities. And then afterwards, during the observation, they jot down how children actually did respond. And this is a really exciting part of the process, because sometimes a child will respond very differently, and sometimes that can be very positive. So the observers might be saying, well, actually, she was using some really powerful maths vocabulary that I didn't realize she'd absorbed. But other times you might say, well, actually, I noticed that she had lost focus after 90 seconds of teacher talk. So it enables the observers to get a very fine-tuned view of what's happening for children. After the lesson, the teacher who taught the lesson and the 2 observers debrief the lesson, discuss their observations, plan the next lesson in light of what they observed, so in light of what they discovered. And generally, lesson study is a 3-lesson cycle. So this is taken from the handbook, but you can see how the cycle works. So you have your joint planning, you teach, you interview the pupils, and then you move on to the next lesson, and then the 3rd lesson. So I'll just squeeze along a little bit. And now, this is the template that I really like. So here you have your lesson stages, and for case pupil A, how you predict they will respond and how they are observed to respond. And I really like this because it fine-tunes the observation process, and it really makes you think very hard and deeply about how children are going to react to different elements of a lesson. Something else from the handbook, some ideas about how you interview pupils and some example questions. So it's a really handy booklet to download. Something else, what did you enjoy most about the lesson? What aspect of the teaching worked best for you? So it's a very structured way of accessing pupil voice. Here we've got the post-lesson study discussion record, and again, this enables teachers to jot down their notes. Sometimes because of the school timetable, it's not possible to have the debrief immediately after the lesson, or it's not possible to plan the next lesson immediately after the observation. So having a template for recording can be really powerful. This is quite nice. How did the curricula or the pedagogical approach help or hinder, and what surprises were there? So there are some really thought-provoking questions here. So here's an example of a lesson planning sheet looking at curricular access. And in this particular example, they are focusing on a child who finds it difficult to voluntarily communicate in lessons. So the idea was that the lesson was planned to help her to get more involved in discussions. And the success criteria was looking at 2 different strategies that would empower her to achieve this, such as having question cards and discussion dice. However, I just want us to pause here, because sometimes it's really important not just to think about strategies that are specific to the child, but to think about how we might make the lesson as a whole more inclusive and more engaging. So it's not just about how can we get the child up to where they need to be for the lesson. Sometimes it's about creating a lesson that's engaging and inviting and inclusive, such that you actually only need to make very small tweaks in order to differentiate. So I just want us to have a quick look at the types of things that we might do to really make a lesson more engaging and more inclusive. So collaborative learning is a really important element here. And I heard a statistic quite recently. I don't know the research it came from, but apparently some children may only utter 4 words in a lesson. And I think it's very interesting that when you do a learning walk, you may still see a great deal of front of class teaching, and it generally isn't that inclusive. It's not that supportive of anybody with anxiety or literacy difficulties or impulse control or attention issues or working memory issues or speech communication and language needs. So thinking about how we can make lessons engaging and collaborative can be a really important part of inclusion. So the types of things that can really support oracy and language development would include thinking skills, problem-based learning, enriched maths, philosophy for children, some lovely research called Spring Social Pedagogy Research in Groups, and I've left the references for you at the end of this presentation. So the other types of things that we could do to really support children to access collaborative learning is pre-teach key ideas. And again, somebody else stated this, and I really like this, but if we're going to spend 20 minutes on catch-up, why not spend 20 minutes prior to the lesson so that the child can be clever and they can have core vocabulary and they can be the one to explain key ideas to other children in the class. And you can have an incredibly impactful alteration of self-esteem by pre-teaching rather than remedial teaching. So a lot of this is about allowing children with special needs to have access to prior knowledge. So they are important and they are the key information holders. We can have core vocabulary on display, possibly with prompt pictures so that children can remember what they are. We can give information in multisensory ways. We can pair children with complementary skills. We can provide sentence starters or visual frameworks to really enable access to prior knowledge. We can practice turn-taking skills. We can use a lot of prior knowledge and make sure that the curriculum is based around special interests, and we can teach respectful listening skills and encourage children to build on what another child has just said. So the post-lesson study discussion can really help us to think about what type of progress did children make, what strategies worked well, what strategies didn't, and what surprises were there. So I'm going to look very quickly at some research. I'm aware that I've got just under 3 minutes, but we were looking at structures and processes around lesson study in both special and mainstream schools and looking at the potential impact of lesson study. So our methodology included interviews, visits, and questionnaires. And we crucially, I've highlighted the question I want us to focus on. So we were looking at the impact of lesson study on pupils, staff, and the organisation. And the type, I noticed that my button has suddenly stopped working. So we looked at what impact do you think lesson study has had, pupil outcomes, pupil learning, classroom practice. And maybe you could move the next slide. My button has stopped working. And one of the impacts, one of the schools identified that lesson study enabled teachers to have greater ownership of their own learning, and it deprivatized practice. So teachers were much more comfortable about sharing good practice and asking teachers for advice. And a lot of, I heard from a number of schools, this sense of problem solving. So one wonderful school said, what we now say is when we have a difficulty in a lesson or a child isn't accessing the curriculum, we might say, shall we lesson study it and try and find the solution? And I really like that. So it helped to develop new pedagogies and led to a better understanding of how children learn, including thinking about attainment and soft measures of learning as well. And some schools found that it led to changes in school policy and practice, looking at collaborative learning, looking at assessment for learning. Thank you. For the next slide. What kind of questions did schools explore? Things like, can we teach exploratory talk for more independent group work? How can we increase the frequency and quality of the interaction and communication of focused pupils? How can we improve pupils' flexibility of thought and creative thinking? Can we improve written communication? And how can we support pupils in two-way conversation so they feel more valued? Thank you. So School One had a really positive impact on staff, and I really like this palpable energy for inquiry and greater commitment to collaboration, sense of trust developing and increasing confidence to articulate and share experience. Next slide, please. Impact on pupils. I really like this, but leading to a redesign and a refinement of the curriculum as a result of lesson study work, but really increasing pupil voice and pupil choice and putting that at the centre of curriculum provision. Thank you. Next slide. And just a final point. Oh, let's stop my phone there. A lovely piece of research from Bram Norridge and Anna Ilonen, who looked at lesson study in respect of assessment for learning. And teachers at the beginning were asked to identify pupil strengths and weaknesses, as well as lesson barriers and enablers. And at the beginning of the process, teachers spoke much more about student perceived weaknesses. And at the end of the process, they spoke much less about what they saw as the weaknesses of students, and they spoke much more about what they could do as teachers to remove barriers to learning and increase enablers to access the curriculum. So it led to this real shift in teachers identifying what they could do to enable curriculum access, rather than assuming that it was the child that wasn't able to access a curriculum. So I'll stop there. Really, at the end of this, I've got some nice resources for you as well. But the crucial thing is it's all about joint professional practice, working with colleagues, and the focus on pupil strengths becomes an observation activity and not an empty mantra. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. If we could move on to Janet, please. Janet Hoskin, thank you.
Hi there, thank you. Okay, thanks very much. Right, this evening I'm going to talk about challenging assumptions that we might have about special educational needs and the importance of challenging assumptions. Some of the things I'm going to talk about have already been talked about and touched on, but that's good that we're singing from the same sheet, as it were. Okay, so I'm going to focus on exploring and challenging assumptions about SEND and difference, thinking about policy and how policy has helped to shape these assumptions and maybe oppose these assumptions as well. And I'm hopefully going to get onto looking at how teachers in the schools we can challenge these assumptions as well. Okay, so first of all, who am I? I'm a mother of a disabled young person who's now 21. Here's a photo of him. I never expected to see this photo of him with a mortarboard on his head. He just graduated a couple of months ago. But I'm also a university lecturer. I've been a teacher and now I teach at the University of East London, which is a post-92 institution. And I'm saying that really because our students aren't traditional learners, students in the sense of students who go to university. A lot of them are older, many have children, many don't have English as their first language. Some of them are doing research, dissertations or theses on places of their origin, different post-colonial settings. And so this is very interesting and I think quite relevant when we come on to the rest of this talk. So my guiding principles then are really thinking about how we as teachers see children with special educational needs and how we see ourselves as inclusive practitioners really, really matters. And there's a brilliant chapter by Truston Robinson that really addresses these issues in the book, Inclusion in the Primary School. It's really important to challenge thinking. It's not just about, oh, here are lots of different perspectives. It's really important that we as teachers are challenging anti-oppressive pedagogies and that we're aware of them, and that we're committed to decolonising the curriculum, that we're not just offering a curriculum that as well says is boy, straight, middle class, able and citizen narrative. And finally, that we allow space for students, whether they're students in HE, whether there are pupils in the staff room, in the classroom, to tell their own story and bring their own experiences, so that we're not just seeing them as deficit, but actually they have their own strengths, they have their own experiences that are really important and will help us to get to know them much better. Okay, so what are these underlying assumptions then? So this has already been talked quite a bit by Margaret, and I think a little bit by Catherine, but you know, this normative model of difference that Florian and Hart talk about and is everywhere, I mean, it's dominant in education, but of course it's dominant in life. As soon as we're born, we're measured against other children in our little red books. You know, are we putting on enough weight? Are we long enough? Are we short enough? All these sorts of things, and very much about how we have to be in that middle area between, you know, 85 and 115. That's where we want to be, and we don't want to be anywhere else. And if we're outside of that, then it can be problematic. And as Margaret said earlier, this sort of model that seems to be fixed in education does mean that often teachers feel underconfident to deal with anybody who doesn't fit in with a majority area into the bell curve. And I think that's really, really sad, because, you know, there's so much inclusive practice that is brilliant. There's so much work that's done by teachers that often they don't realise can support and work with and champion the work of young people with special educational needs. And also, the problems with this is that we end up with this idea of young people who don't fit in with a normative curve either being seen as other, so either being seen as a problem or actually being, as Chouinard says, invisible. And so they're just not seen and they're not catered for. We're not putting them at the forefront of our planning because maybe we're not given the opportunity, we're not given the chance. And so they become invisible. And, you know, this is so in life. It's not just about the education system, but it can happen a lot in our classrooms. And I'd say that, you know, often this is because we see the child, or we're encouraged to see the child, therefore as deficit in a much more of a medical model than as seeing them as the strengths that they can achieve. So if you see this young person here, for example, this is my example of a really bad medical model here of a young person with muscular dystrophy focusing on his deficit, whereas, you know, the photo of my child at the beginning, my young person Saul, you know, he's a young person who's got strengths, abilities, he's been to university. You know, what does he know about computer programming? Not, oh, isn't it a shame that he can't walk? So focusing on what children can do is a massive way of challenging these assumptions. And the problem is that when we other these other children with special educational needs, children who are disabled, then we end up with, you know, the terrible things that we've seen in the last couple of years. So, you know, othering leads to dehumanizing. We see that young people, if we look at the statistics for COVID, so many, 8 times, people with learning disabilities were 8 times more likely to die of COVID than the rest of people. When COVID first happened, I'm sure we're all sitting there watching all the news flashes, and we were told over and over again that, you know, it wasn't a problem, it was only going to affect people with underlying health conditions. So, you know, we're kind of encouraged to think along these ways by only focusing on a certain part of our population. And really, that's, as teachers, we want to be challenging those assumptions. And again, we've talked about the examination system, how it excludes children who don't fit into those areas, and we end up with a lack of imagined futures for these young people. We're not expecting them to do well, we're seeing them outside a system, and we're not catering on, we're not putting them in the middle of it and finding things that they can do to have a sort of challenging and meaningful life. And I think over COVID, Frances Ryan, who's a brilliant journalist in The Guardian, you know, she really sort of was really talking about how all these things are happening all the time, but only at the time of COVID were we really able to see that this is what life is like for people. And yet, for such a long time, there's been low expectations and lack of aspiration for young people. Okay, so moving on to be a bit more hopeful, I think. Right, so Desai and Sanya then talk about how we can move away from this marginalisation, move away from this othering by decolonising the curriculum. And I want to talk a little bit about this now. You know, how can we challenge these assumptions? How can we decolonise the curriculum? A lot has been done in the academy and HE around issues of gender and race to do with decolonisation, but quite often we don't talk about disability. And really, what sorts of things should we be talking about when I'm teaching my special education students, or when I'm working, doing talks with PGCE students, people on ITE? Now, I think it's absolutely crucial that people are aware, that our future teachers are aware of the social model of disability as they move into becoming teachers in the workplace. The fact that disability is an oppression that's created by society, that we're listening to the voices of disabled people, and we're understanding that there's intersectionality, and that we're understanding that young people can speak for themselves. Now, some amazing examples from what Amelia was talking about, of actually how we can get young people's voices heard. And in the academy, we need to be thinking about what we're teaching. You know, what research papers are we using? Are we using papers that are created by people who are disabled, who have SEND? We are looking at emancipatory research approaches, or are we still focusing on the experiences of inclusion that is very sort of Western, very experts as the special educational needs teachers? And I think on that matter, we have to be clear that we think about ourselves, reflect on our own positions. Myself, as a white Western woman, you know, what's my position in these situations? But I'm also a parent of a child with special educational needs. I've been through that system. He's disabled. How does that change my focus and my understanding and my experience? Okay. So Catherine talked about very much about the policy and about the special educational needs reforms. And I think that really, you know, the marketisation and the liberalisation of education, we know, means that children with SEND are often seen as what Blackmore calls unmarketable commodities, that maybe they aren't able to compete in the examination fora in the same way that other children do. And if a system is like that, it's very difficult perhaps to change it, but we need to be aware of these assumptions that are made. Similarly, what our ideas of inclusion are not just about what's going on in the classroom in the UK, but you know, what's going on in the world. What does inclusion mean? I love the discussion of joy, of love, sorry, and joy, because actually, you know, if we look at research from some of the African countries, their local knowledge, they might say, well, actually, we're doing some of this inclusion already. And Morton talks about Ubuntu and other community ways of looking after each other that actually already exist. And so our ideas of inclusion in some ways actually, you know, colonial in themselves. So Catherine was talking about the Children and Families Act, and yes, I would say that as a parent, there were some very positive steps in the recent SEND reform, so particularly putting children and families at the heart of the process. But we know that it was introduced in a time of austerity, that there's still thousands of children out of school, that there's been a lack of accountability. You know, these outcomes that were so, you know, brilliantly co-produced, perhaps, where maybe they were brilliantly co-produced, but is there a, you know, does it matter if they're achieved? Who's looking? Who's accountable for whether those outcomes are achieved? And this idea of the select committee saying that, well, you know, what we really need is a culture change. It isn't just about a law, it's about getting people, and I think that comes, a lot of that does come from challenging assumptions, really. Teachers and schools, we've already heard some really good examples of that, but you know, having this positive professional identity, having confidence, not teaching to the majority, but being personalised is incredibly important, as Margaret said. Thinking about our whole school policies, you know, and who are our teachers? Do we have disabled teachers and governors? Are we showing that we're interested in people's strengths? Are we actually opposing oppressive pedagogies? And are we thinking about what it is that our young people can offer to the class? What are their strengths? What are their experiences? What can they share within the classroom? Maybe they know everything about dinosaurs, but they can't possibly write it down. You know, what sorts of collaborative ways can we get working in our classrooms? And again, Amelia has shown some brilliant examples of that. Okay, I've got a message. Okay. 3 minutes. So, well, I think I've done quite well, actually. I'm always up to my last slide. So, new assumptions then. So, high aspirations. Will we be left with the same policy as the 2014 Children and Families Act? I don't know. I think there are some possibilities of having high aspirations from that piece of legislation, but maybe there will be more major changes. Post-humanists like Braidotti talk about how disability, sorry, there's a typo there, disability can offer us a glimpse of a different future. Actually, do we have to have, do we have to celebrate and champion this bell curve? Do we have to celebrate and champion marketized education system, or can we champion something else? Can we disrupt it in any way? And Carter, I think, is just my final point really, is that by just questioning the assumptions that I've talked about, particularly along the lines of teaching to the majority, by questioning those, it's the first step for decolonizing the curriculum, which I think is what we need to be doing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Good timing. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for your talk. We're going to move over to Chandrika. And after this, we'll take some questions. So please, if you have questions, could you post them in the question and answer so that I can field them when we come to that section. So over to Chandrika.
Very good. Thank you very much. Right, my topic is SEND looking through intersectionality lens. And I certainly started my career working with young children with special education needs back in India. And then my PhD was also with children with special education needs, specifically children with Down syndrome. And for me, inclusion is everybody who is unique and with from a wider perspective that includes gender, race, culture, ethnicity, and yeah. So I want to bring in the concept of intersectionality and how we need to look at SEND from the lens of intersections or intersectionality as such. Okay, let's see if I can move the slides. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah. So I'd like to, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's been a real pleasure. And I'm really glad to be the last person speaking here because I've taken so much from the other speakers, and also it's quite reassuring to see that there's so much of passion and love in everybody, and then that it's not only just me who has it. Okay, so I always tend to show pictures and then ask, what do you see on the in the picture on the right? And I was hoping that we could be a little bit interactive, but then I'm sort of suspecting that the answers could be, I don't know, I'm stereotyping here. So it could be single answers of you seeing the child, obviously, the child who is disabled, a Black child, but then what else do we see? And then as it was mentioned by Janet and also about labels, honestly. So do we necessarily describe who the child is based on what we see visibly, based on the labels, really? And what is it that we do not see? And I'd like to pick on the idea of Margaret, who mentioned detective. It's important to be a detective and keep digging on who is this child and what are the needs of this child, rather than making it more stereotypical, really. And so let me move the slide again. Right, I'd like to talk a little bit about intersectionality. So generally, intersectionality relates to own identities, and then it relates to how you see yourself and how others see you. And then, is there any gaps that is perceived by you as an individual? And then do you see any gaps of how you see yourself and how others see you? And then it could relate to race, ethnicity, sex, gender, identity, socioeconomic status, whether you follow a particular religion or faith tradition, whether you have a disability or specific ability as such, or are non-disabled, and again, your home language, whether you see yourself speaking the majority language, or you speak a minority language, or English as additional language, or it's again how others see you as well, and sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and where you live or grew up. So all of these aspects might actually enable or sometimes disable the person as such. And then I'm thinking of Amelia, who mentioned about how people would be assuming who you are based on how they see you. And so there's interaction of some of these multiple factors that people see in a person, especially children with disabilities, that leads to discrimination. And then this discrimination can happen at all levels or different levels, right from when the child is born, when the child is assessed, identified, and goes to school provision. And it happens in all the different circumstances. So some of the categories that I've already included in my previous slide include race, disability, which could be visible, invisible sometimes. It could be a migrant, again, that carries a stronger label on itself as well. And religion in terms of religious beliefs on religious identity, which is visible, not visible, and then what is that going to have an impact on the child from the family's perspective as well, and what does the practitioner believe that the families would believe in just because they believe that this particular child belonging to a particular religion would have these characteristics, or they might have certain abilities, disabilities. And Catherine did mention about the marketization, come back to that, and gender. And there are lots of stereotypes around gender, and we do have some statistics pointing to the fact that more boys are identified as having special education needs and disabilities for a long time. And poverty, again, how a child coming from a poor house or a poor area, disadvantaged area, could be a big label, and how the child could be discriminated, or there would be lots of assumptions about the child. And EAL, child English as additional language, child's ability to speak the majority language, or how the child would be identified or assessed in English in their in English, and how the child's ability to speak, understand, and respond in English might have an impact. Yeah, and I've experienced, well, not experienced myself, but then I've actually heard from some of my students saying that that has been an issue, and some of the children might have been wrongly identified as having special education needs because of their speaking English as an additional language, or restricted ability to speak English as such. So what is the relevance of intersectionality? Intersectionality relates to the child in terms of how the child is seen, whether is it the label of the special education needs or the child with disability. is the child seen as this label, or do you see the child from a big picture of what else are the strengths of the child, as it's been mentioned before? And who is the parent of this child, or parents of this child? And as Catherine mentioned, is this parent is knowledgeable, and then is that a disadvantage? Or if the parent is not knowledgeable, less confident, and then would that have an impact on how the child will receive the services? And then again, the practitioners, again, do they necessarily, it's again, how do they see themselves from the perspective of their ability to meet the needs of this individual child with a particular label, or do they see the big picture? And same with the professionals as well. It's again, the relevance of intersectionality lies with the whole process, all the people, stakeholders who are actually engaged in supporting this child or in meeting this child's needs as such. And the intersectionality in relation to what is the impact of intersectionality is about expectations. What expectations do we have about this child? Again, this has been related to by most the speakers before, in relation to how the child's background and how the label can actually have an impact on what is this child expected to show their abilities, or mostly perhaps inabilities perhaps, and how the child is assessed and identified from the perspective of their disability or special education needs as such. And how does the curriculum and resources reflect on, does it necessarily meet the needs of that individual child? And why intersectionality, why should we look at SEND from the intersectional lens, is because we want to meet unique needs, provide equity and justice and inclusion from the perspective of ensuring that the child is not only present in a situation, but also given access and also enabled to participate, and most importantly, achieving to the best of their abilities. Yeah. And just a few examples. I'm sure there will be a lot more than this. So it's again looking at a refugee child showing behavioral disorders might face inclusion in schools. And then it's because of schools failed to consider the intersections of his identities, especially from the perspective of culture and identity expectations. And again, we have children are perceived to be different based on their visible single identity, whether it is gender or religion or SEND as well, perhaps. And then this can subsume their other identities and capabilities. And again, placement of children from migrant backgrounds in less challenging classrooms and segregating them from mainstream settings. I think I'm sort of echoing this, what Catherine mentioned, relating to Pakistani students. And an EAL child may be labeled to have special education needs based on assessment in English language. And also, there's been consistent statistics that Black Caribbean children are all identified with SEND. And just some food for thought. It's important to acknowledge the intersectional identities of all children. I think I would like to emphasize here what is visible and what is not what is invisible, and the invisibility, invisible categories that we need to dig for and be a detective there. And appreciation of difference is crucial in creating supportive and inclusive learning environments. I think this one is very important, to be aware of everybody's own biases, stereotypes, and challenge our normal, in quotes, perceptions. Sometimes these perceptions could be ingrained in the immediate society as well. So that's very important. And raise awareness of own knowledge outside the box relating to the wider identities and cultures. And use intersectional lens to relate to all children rather than perceive them in singular identities. Ensure the provision for children identified as having special education needs and disabilities is influenced by an intersectionality lens. And finally, I strongly believe in this, that we have to unlearn, relearn, and keep learning our new knowledge and understanding. I think I'll hopefully I'm there in time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chandrika. That was perfect. Thank you in timing. I wonder whether the panel could put their cameras back on, the four of you, and because I have some questions that I'm going to field from the question and answer box. And everybody, it's not too late to post questions if you wish. I'll pick them up. So I'll take the first. I'm just going to use the questioners' first names because of the recording, if that's okay. So the first question is for Margaret, and it's from Claire. And I think you've seen the question, Margaret, but it's about, I'll read it for the audience. How would you teach early career teachers how to innovate and adapt to the needs of learners? This idea is so powerful, but I'm thinking about the cognitive load of new teachers. Is the ability to adapt and innovate something that comes with experience? Can it be taught? So that first question is to Margaret.
It's a great question. Thanks, Claire. And yeah, I think the answer, yes, we can. Difficult, yes, but I think one of the things that we've looked at in developing some of the ITT resources on the SEND Gateway that you might want to have a look at was actually really trying to tackle that question. And what we did was look at sort of case studies, and they were developed by teacher educators and school SENCOs together. We thought about how working through those with mentors would really support that kind of, it's the onion, really, the peeling back of the onion, and really getting confident with the unknown. So looking not at complex learners, and I really stress that, but at complex learning situations. So and it might be, say, a working memory issue or cognitive load issue that you actually unpicking in a classroom, and thinking about how do we scaffold the learning so that young person can still achieve those high expectations alongside everybody else. And in a sense, that's your question too, is that we've got to be really careful that we don't use cognitive load as a means to put lower ceilings on our expectations of young people and what they can achieve. I've got a child who's on the first percentile for working memory. And, so actually he's very capable, but we really have to think about how we chunk that information, how we hook that information for him, how he's going to retain that information. And that can be really effective. So he's not overwhelmed by it. And the same would apply for a developing teacher in the same way.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Margaret. I wondered if any of the panel want to come in on that question before we move to the next one. Do any of you?
Yeah, I'm happy to make a quick comment. I think with the early career teacher, it very much depends on the type of school that you're in and whether you're encouraged to be responsive and reflective. And that's why I really do like things such as lesson study, because it provides a structure for that type of collaboration. So I think it's very difficult for a teacher on his or her own to be everything they want to be, but with the right degree of support and collaboration and with this palpable energy for inquiry, then I think anything is possible.
And can I add something to that, Amelia? Because I was really struck when you were talking, because I do think lesson study is such a powerful tool of inquiry. But I think we really need in schools to really recognise what you were saying about it being a process, not an event. And I think sometimes it's used as an event, and actually what it is a really great pedagogical process.
Thank you. I have a question from Catherine. I think this is directed at Janet. So hello, she thanks everyone for the range of talks and asks, she says, Janet talks about decolonizing the curriculum and inclusion itself and challenging changing assumptions. I think society is still at risk of using traditional deficit models of understanding and viewing disability. How do we successfully change and challenge assumptions? And I think that question's for Janet.
Hi, thank you, Catherine. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you only need to try and book a holiday cottage or a table in a cafe with somebody with a wheelchair, and you'll realise how society is totally at risk of deficit models, because nothing is geared towards anybody with difference, and we're seen as a problem, and oh, it's her again. So it is very much a kind of deficit world that we live in, unfortunately. However, I do think that there's amazing work going on with people who've got special educational needs and who are disabled, and I think we can do masses within our little areas, within schools, through some of the things that have been talked about, that Amelia was talking about, and Margaret, but also I think thinking about the school policy. I mean, the school where I'm governor, for example, is so committed to inclusion. All the other schools in the area are kind of, we're zero tolerance, come to our school, you know, we're going to get the best exam results. And our school will say, we're not going to get the best exam results, but we're really inclusive and our children are really happy and we really care about their mental health. So I think having a kind of a very firm, good message from, you know, the top is really, really important. Obviously policy is massively important, whether we, you know, whether there's legal rights and what we think about them, but having the Equality Act is amazing, and we can always, you know, use that to support and to protect people. So that's, I mean, finally, sorry, I'm going on, but when the new reforms came in, I was doing a little bit of work with some people from Preparing for Adulthood, and they did some amazing work at really raising aspirations with parents and with teachers and with young people. And really that was about sharing good practice and good news. And I think that is really underestimated, that if you do something that really works well and you're working with the strengths of the young person and you're sharing that with others and you're showing them how you've done it and, you know, the outcomes that that young person has achieved, that that goes a massive way to making a change.
Thank you. Does any other member of the panel want to add a comment to that, or?
Can I add a little comment, if that's all right? I'd like to strongly echo what Janet has just said about attitudes, and that certainly makes a huge difference. And I've actually seen in one of the schools in Manchester where the child, the whole of the school echoed the fact that the child has given more to the school than school giving to the child. And I was so thrilled, and it was such a beautiful feeling. And I actually had several examples of how this particular child has actually given back to the school, a 10-year-old child. And for me, that's a great attitude, and inclusion will happen, will certainly happen only if there's a will, and where there's a will, certainly there's a way. And it comes right from the top to bottom. And I was told that when this child came in the nursery, the whole school were up in arms saying, oh my God, how do we even handle this child? Because this child is visibly different. But they were all turned around within very short few weeks, really. And the child went up to the end of the school, primary school, and every single person loves the child, and he has done wonders, miracles as well, apparently, in the school. I don't have time to tell all the stories. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Chandrika. I think we've got time for one more question, and it's from me, and I think it's to the panel generally. So you can take this in any order. So my question is specifically about the curriculum. So Margaret talked about teaching the pupil, not the condition, in curriculum planning. Amelia spoke of redesigning and refining the curriculum. Janet, you talked about those normative assumptions of difference that are represented in the curriculum. And Chandrika, your ideas on intersectionality and how the curriculum, how that's sometimes embedded in the curriculum in terms of intersectional identities. I wonder what our hopes for the curriculum are, whether the curriculum at the moment is if you feel is sufficient. So any thoughts on the specific general curriculum issues?
I'll go first. I think to be adaptive, you know, to feel that we can be flexible with the curriculum around not just the needs of individual children, but the needs of the setting, the locality, you know, the importance of a more holistic approach. And I think teachers are brave, leaders are brave, and I think they are stretching the curriculum in multiple ways and finding they are problem solvers as well. And I think we need to be hopeful, but I think we also need to keep pushing and be demanding that flexibility has to be respected, and it has to be within the grasp of the school leadership. You know, they need autonomy to make those decisions and not to feel restricted and limited.
Thank you, Margaret.
Yeah, I would just come in on that. I think in some places the curriculum is too restrictive. I think this isn't necessarily the place to sort of speak politics particularly, but I think that in recent history we took the wrong direction perhaps. But I do think that Ofsted has tried quite hard to redress that by putting some of the authority and power back into the hands of schools. And I would pick up on Margaret's point that we need to retain that sense of authority and be led by the child and the family, and really think about whether we are serving the children rather than serving some kind of neoliberal authority. Neoliberal authority. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what the others have said, really. Absolutely. I mean, thinking about the curriculum in secondary schools, for example, quite often the creative arts seem to have, you know, taken a hit. There's been such a funding crisis, not being political, but so I think there's certain subjects that aren't offered that could benefit, and that, you know, children would really like to do if we're going to be child-centered and look at what people want to follow. That's a real problem if you're within a school that has had to make those decisions. And the fact that, you know, it's still, the curriculum is still very much about getting, you know, doing an EBAC qualification and 5 A to C's. So although they're called, you know, 1 to 7s or whatever, 7 to 9s. So I think it's, you know, tricky, isn't it, talking about curriculum, because we're still judged at the end of our time at school by certain things, and how can we change that, and how can we build into, you know, getting a job and a career that doesn't go down that route all the time, and can be celebrated as well. Sorry, ranting.
No, not at all. Thank you. I'm watching the time, and it is time for us to move back to the main room. Before I do, no, not at all. Can I thank everybody for the four panelists and for the audience for their questions. Watch out in the main room, because I'm going to be asked to do some sort of summary of the session, which I'm going to do really badly, so forgive me. So what I'll do is, I won't do a summary. What I'll do is I'll just do a couple of highlights, and if I've missed anything or misrepresent you, please forgive me. So I'll see everyone back in the main room.
Great. I think we've got everybody back with us. I'd like to first of all just thank you everybody for staying with us, and hoping that the technology has not let people down. Can I bring both Victoria and Richard into this session immediately? If we can see you both, that would be fantastic. Is Victoria with us? Lovely. Great. We're going to start this final session, and it has just been a dream to listen to everybody. Victoria, can you start just please by giving just a flavour and a sense of what was happening in your wonderful group?
Well, saving the world, I think, is the main way to put it, really. Absolutely amazing discussions, and our speakers. I mean, we had Amelie, who was talking about the importance of the graduated approach, and what that looks like, the need for noticing, which is, you know, a really key term about gathering that information about those pupils and finding out about them to then move on to steps. We had Colin, who took us on a journey on a language bus, which was fabulous. And we talked about, the importance of language, those really simple steps of, reducing background noise, repeating phrases, keywords, slowing down, visual cues, all of those things that I think we can take for granted as we're speaking far too quickly, as I'm doing right now. Sorry, Colin. Then thinking about Luke, very passionate about providing everything that an autistic learner might need, and thinking about the actual child and the fact that they aren't just they're little people, but they turn into big people, and we need to think about their life, their quality of life. So thinking about how we can do that and have healthy, happy children rather than traumatized children trying to fit into a system. And then Kirsten was talking about, the Scottish system and how that framework for inclusion fits in and how it links to teacher standards. And in our kind of, discussion and all of the amazing questions that we had from our delegates, we were thinking about not narrowing down the curriculum, but actually thinking about that broader curriculum, those overarching skills, independence, life things that we need to support. We talked about the constraints of assessment and our curriculum and assessment, all of that kind of thing, and the other organisations which contribute to that. We talked about the need for working together, this absolutely wonderful way in which we can have mainstream and special provision working together so that there are more choices, that we learn from each other, and there isn't this dichotomy, them or us situation, but we've actually got that real, teamwork going on. Language is key, and then we ended with the fact that we as teachers all need to be learners, and if we don't think something is right, we need to question it and we need to learn. So that was it in a nutshell, but absolutely incredible sessions. And I hope everyone enjoyed it, because I certainly did.
Victoria, thank you very much. I might come back to you, Victoria, in a moment, just while we get the technology up for any questions that are going to come in from our audience in the sort of couple of minutes that can sometimes take, if there are questions that you might want to pose on behalf of colleagues that were in your group. Richard, over to you, please.
Thanks, Jerry. We had a wonderful panel, but I did finish it by apologising, because I said I was going to try and summarise or give highlights, and that it would be an impossible task. It sounded like a good idea, Jerry, when we proposed it to you. But Margaret led us on talking about SEND and the art of detection, which was quite an interesting metaphor to use, looking at with the idea of teaching the pupil and not the condition. Amelia introduced the idea of lesson study, with the purpose of knowing more about pupils by observation, and the need to redesign and refine the curriculum as a result, which as an outcome of lesson study. Janet led us on the idea of challenging assumptions, and that where normative assumptions of difference, in which the curriculum is a kind of mechanism, perhaps the need to deal with the idea of the curriculum as tokenism. Chandrika spoke to us about intersectionality and intersectional identities, and the who, why, and what, the who, what, and why of those. We had some interesting questions to the panel. It was interesting that the panel took those individually, but also spoke to them. Each spoke to those questions. One about the need to train early career teachers to adapt, to be able to adapt, and whether that was possible, whether that was asking too much. We had some discussion about that. Then we had a discussion about the deficit models that are present in the curriculum, and the need to decolonize the curriculum. And that led to a general discussion of the ways in which the curriculum restricts or is flexible enough, or overly rigid perhaps, for a child-focused curriculum. But overall, I thought I enjoyed it very much, and I think the audience did as well.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, both of you. Richard, I'll say the same thing. If there are any questions that you feel are appropriate to ask in this section, sort of just from the discussions in your group, I might come back to you if that's all right in a moment. I'm going to bring, I'm now going to invite everybody to put in questions, and I can see there's a question coming in from Peter Hick, which I'll ask in a moment. I'd just like to bring colleagues in from Scotland and Northern Ireland, and thinking about both Kirsten and Colin. And I'm just thinking about the curriculum for teacher education. No surprises, of course, that I'm asking that question, but I'm wondering if we can turn to Kirsten first in terms of the curriculum for a future generation of teachers. What sorts of things might or rather should we be looking at, please?
Ah, wow. Well, thankfully, we had a similar question in my group, so I feel a little bit prepared. But in terms of our curriculum for our teachers and teacher education, we spoke about the importance of ensuring that inclusion, diversity, equity is central and something that all students, all student teachers are taught about, explore, learn about, discuss. It's part of their learning outcomes and their experiences on the course. It's not an elective, it's not an add-on. So that was the sort of a brief summary of the tone of the discussion earlier.
And I've just realized, I've just seen Peter's question, which I know, Peter, apologies, I really did not look at the wording of the question. Peter has said, question for Kirsten, in relation to teacher education, what do you think colleagues in England can learn from the Scottish experience, which I think is a far better question than the one I asked. Can you take that question, please, Kirsten?
Thank you, Peter. I'm glad everyone's thinking similarly, and I'm very particularly glad that my 4-year-old's just exited the room, came in there with terrible timing, but has gone again. What's really interesting is we had the inclusive practice programme, which was piloted at the University of Aberdeen, led by Lanny Florian and Martin Rouse, who are, huge names in the world of inclusion. And the research from that is really insightful and really emphasises the need for core exploration around issues of social justice, learning and understanding learning and teaching, and how to be an active professional who can work with and through others to support all learners. We're not saying that every individual teacher has to have all the answers, but knows how to work with and through others. So developing that in our programs has been key, and more recent research has showed that we're quite good at the social justice parts and exploring learning and teaching, but what we're needing to develop further is how we support our student teachers to work with and through others to really ensure that we're meeting all of our learners' needs.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'm going to bring Colin in from Northern Ireland in a moment to see whether or not he can pick up on the same question. Colin, I'll come back to you in a moment. If I can invite everybody, please, to really just fire in questions. And if you can, when you ask your questions, if you can give me the name of the person you'd like to ask your question to. Colin, over to you. I'm going to basically ask you the same question that Peter has asked, which is in relation to teacher education. What do you think colleagues in England can learn from Northern Ireland?
Well, I think, I don't know whether it's true to say that colleagues in England can learn anything from Northern Ireland. I think the four nations can all learn from each other and share more practice actually than we maybe currently do at the moment. We tend to go into our silos in the four regions. But as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, I am very much an advocate of our teacher training colleges changing completely the way they train our young teachers. Basically because I feel that additional needs should be a core subject from year 1 right through to year 4. At the moment, as Kirsten said, in Northern Ireland, it's an elective in your final year of teacher training. And I do not think that's enough. Our Education Authority has changed the profile of our schools in Northern Ireland the last 3 years, with a lot more children who would have received specialist education or specialist placement are now being returned to mainstream classes. So young teachers coming out from 2019 onwards are facing classes with a wider diversity than the teacher training program is training them for. So my advocate would be that we should be training our teachers from year 1 when they go into teacher training college on a range of additional needs that they will meet in the classroom, and specific things like PECS, communication systems, attention autism, those things that they may need to use now in a mainstream classroom, which would have been seen historically as in a specialist centre. So I think teacher training needs to sit back and have a radical look at itself, because we need to prepare young teachers for the classrooms of today and the future, not 15 years ago when teachers were going out and the profile was totally different. I think we're failing our young teachers at the moment, and then failing our children with additional needs who are in those mainstream classrooms. Teachers want to do their best. They are in the job because they want to make a difference. but they're not being given the tools by those support mechanisms, government, teacher training colleges. And I apologise to those representing teacher training colleges. I'm talking about Northern Ireland here, not Scotland or England. But I think that is a big thing we must look at, Jerry. It's definitely a core issue.
Thank you, Colin, for that. I'm going to bring Victoria in and then Richard in to pose some questions to our panel members. I'm going to pick up on a question that we didn't address first time round when Catherine was giving her keynote at the start, but because I was dipping between the two parallel groups, this issue came up again and again in both groups. And the question is, considering the marketization of education agenda, do we have any reflections on how the growth of multi-academy trusts impacts on inclusion? And then Victoria, I'll bring you in a moment for your next question. So I'll say that question again. Considering the marketization of education agenda, do we have any reflections on how the growth of multi-academy trusts impacts on inclusion? And I'm wondering, Catherine, if you're still with us, if I can take that, because that was a question that was originally posed to you in the first session, which we didn't get around to.
I don't have any broad research evidence. I only have anecdotal evidence that it doesn't help. You know, it goes back to the idea of what's it all about, what's it for, and what are these systems doing in terms of producing ideal students, and so many students falling away. You know, I'm really sorry I didn't hear the session on intersectionality, but I think that's extremely important because, you know, I was reading actually recently about when people first talked about special educational needs, that it was framed in a much more broad sort of way. And I think in the way that you were talking about when you're talking about additional support needs, and I think that's quite helpful because of the intersections. It's not just about disability, it's about a whole raft of stuff to do with race, class, poverty, and so on. And so I imagine that those multi-academy trusts are producing more and more children who fall outside the category of ideal or normal child.
Thank you, Catherine. Jeanette Scull is asking a general question, and I'm looking to, I might actually pose this to Chandrika. Chandrika, a question from Jeanette Scull, which is, does the curriculum have to be delivered through adaptation, or is there another way forward?
I think it's how do you adapt, what do you adapt, and would it necessarily meet the needs of the child or the groups of children? And it's important not to think of this is what I'm going to adapt, and is it going to work? Is it not going to work? Why will it work? And the same thing, what you have used this year may not necessarily work next year. So I think it's a matter of what do you want to adapt? How do you want to adapt? And to the extent of what would be the results of your adaptation, really. I don't know whether I've answered that or not.
Thank you, Chandrika. Victoria, have you got questions for your panel members?
We did have a question that was directed towards Colin in terms of any great reading around, you know, the use of language in terms of providing a more inclusive environment. But maybe that could be opened up a little wider as well, and after Colin's kind of inputted in that, because I know there was some recommended reading there. It'd be lovely to hear from some of the other panelists as well.
Yeah, well, the book I recommended to the lady that asked me the question is a book that I started to read when I was getting interested in this area, and then it really fired my interest, and I got further into it and worked with speech and language therapists. But the book is called Effective Communication and Engagement with Children and Young People, Their Families and Carers. It's available on Amazon, and if you just type that title in, it'll come up on Amazon. The ISBN number is, I'm just getting it here for you, is 18444525654. And it just gives an introduction into the importance of language and how it can be overlooked quite often because we're so busy with the big items in teaching and learning, but we forget that the main way children learn is the interaction between teacher or classroom assistant and child. And we sometimes don't look at that as close as we should, because we could actually be hindering a child's learning by just the way we're talking to them, how we talk to them. And I think that's crucial as a practical thing in the classroom to help our children with additional needs gain their potential. I'm a very practical person. I'm not into research or stuff like that. That's not my forte. I didn't like to read books as a child, but I'm very into the practical classroom, what makes a difference when the child's in front of you. So that book is very interesting, and it'll give you then references to other books which go into it in more detail, but that's a good starter.
Thank you, Colin. Can I ask the panel members, everybody's been very polite and turned their cameras off, but I think we just need to, it'd just be lovely if we could actually see you all. I think the bandwidth is just, yeah, oh, that's so much nicer. That's lovely. That's great. Thank you very much. Indeed, that's better. It just feels a little bit more real. I've got a question coming for Margaret. Margaret, this one is, can teachers have agency in curriculum making and the flexibility and the capacity to be adaptive?
I think we talked in our group about the rigidity of the curriculum and the narrowness of the curriculum. And I do think that I totally agree with colleagues that is a real challenge. However, I think we've also got those sort of opportunities to be bold and to be brave and to ensure that we are putting that as a sort of real front and center ambition for schools, and using our knowledge of formative assessment, what we're learning about the young people, what we're learning about what works, to actually adapt the curriculum. And there's some really great stuff. I think Dr. Nicola Crossley has done some really nice stuff on curriculum adaptation that I think is really useful in this space. But I think it's also about that kind of permission, giving ourselves permission to make sure that we are meeting the needs of children. And Amelia mentioned that Ofsted has helped us in that ambition. And I think I absolutely agree with you, Amelia, that we're also looking at the roles and responsibilities of subject leaders in terms of shaping the curriculum and adapting the curriculum. Recognizing that they do have the skills to work with the SENCO, to work with outside agencies, to support them and collaboratively to adapt that curriculum so it reaches all learners. And I think that's really exciting. And whilst we're ambitious for change, we're also ambitious for what we're doing right here and right now as well.
Thank you, Margaret. Christina Rose. Christina, I've almost understand your question, but not completely. I'm just wondering if you can type it out again, just so, because I'd really like to ask the question, but I haven't fully grasped what the question is. So, Christina, if you don't mind asking that. A question that was posed earlier, and I'm going to pose this to Amelie, if that's all right. And it's in relation to the curriculum. How might the balance of power and shaping things swing to parents and to children? Nothing difficult about that question.
I was going to say that's a big question. I think it goes back. It builds on what everybody's been saying. What Margaret's just said. I was really inspired by what Kirsten said as well about being bold, being brave, being active professionals with and through others. And I think actually thinking about that with and through others and seeing parents and the children and young people we work with as being, very much, at the core and part of that. They are experts as well that we need to work alongside. And I think it's, recognizing that and being brave about that and naming. I was again really inspired to hear what you said, Catherine, about those structures that place those tensions on those relationships. And I think being brave and naming those and not being afraid to name those, and quite honestly and transparently with the families that we work with, I think allows us to start shifting that, because it gives us then a more level playing field with which we can then start working with each other. And I think I mentioned in our session that there's a huge amount of overwhelm in the system. I think there's also a lot of fear in the system. And going back again to what Catherine was saying, well, let's shift that from fear to love. let's actually remember that we're all in this for the same reason. When we're sat in a meeting with families, with our learners, actually it's because we all want to go on that same journey. And there's different, aspects that we have to take into consideration. But if we recognise that, actually we start shifting that balance of power. Yeah, that's. I'm not sure whether that covers what is a really, really big question. But I just think there's been so many inspirational points that we need to take on as leaders.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that probably was the biggest question of the day, but you handled that beautifully. Amelia, I'd like to ask you something. We've had a question in from somebody called Anonymous, and Anonymous is actually asking, do you think that if we focus on life skills in the curriculum, we possibly may gatekeep other information and other interests of students? That question is for you, Amelia.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'd caution against some children learning life skills and other children doing clever stuff. So I would worry about a false dichotomy. So if I could maybe reshuffle that, what I am interested in is a curriculum that's relevant and that uses special interest and prior learning and knowledge that children care about. So I think it's not a case of either or. I think it's about making the curriculum exciting, engaging, really important to children. And just a very quick anecdote, but I once worked with a boy in year 10 who had mental health needs. And at one point we talked him down from a bridge. He had suicidal ideation. And this is going to sound trivial, but one of the key elements in really helping him to feel better was to have conversations around current affairs and for him to tell me what he thought about what was going on and to have opinions and to articulate why he thought certain things. So there's something about the curriculum being meaningful and relevant and exciting that I think is even more important than life skills as a narrow objective.
I've got comment. It's great doing this. I've got comments coming in from everywhere. I think this is a comment from Margaret. Margaret, is this you that's saying also avoid that deficit language about families as well as pupils, labeling families as hard to reach? I think that was from you, Margaret. Is that correct?
Yeah, sorry, I was just adding to Amelie's point before, which I think is really important about that expertise of families. And we talked earlier, didn't we, a lot about labelling young people, but we do readily label families too often as well and limit our expectations, limit our opportunities to work collaboratively and positively. And I think that's one we really need to shift forward in the future.
Luke, you almost looked like you were going to dive in there, and I just want to bring you in. It felt like you were just about to say something there.
It's so weird because I always sort of say things in my head before I actually say them just to check they're okay, and then sometimes I can't work out whether I've actually said them out loud or not. I was just thinking about, in terms of curriculum, just thinking from a very personal point of view, and anybody that knows me will say the same. If you don't want to talk to me about autism or triathlons, then just give up. I'm not interested. I'm completely useless at absolutely everything else. I'm not even particularly good at autism or triathlons either, but anything beyond that, not interested. I don't think the whole curriculum is ever going to change its tide just to suit me, but certainly a lot of our autistic kids, I remember talking to I'm talking to Chris Packham about it, but he's very much like, I was really interested in the natural world. You put me on in a different lesson, completely switch off. And it goes back to, I think, essentially what everybody's talking about, goes right back to what Catherine's saying about, it's got to come from the heart. It's got to, the love from the kids in terms of what they're interested in and what everybody else understands in terms of what motivates them. But I worry even talking about the curriculum. If you have a demographic norm that most think that the curriculum suits most of those individuals, then by definition, if you fall outside of that demographic norm, then it's not going to suit you. So there has to be something much, much broader than this thing we call the curriculum at present.
Thank you, Luke. Comments coming in from Chandrika saying that it's important to provide opportunities that build on the strengths of the child. And Christina Rose Holly has sort of just changed the wording, and she says leadership courses in Australia don't include disability legislation, culture and adjustments. So culture is not embedded in school. Embrace inclusion. And I'm now looking at the time, and we are rapidly coming to an end of what has been the most extraordinary set of presentations, questions. I can't even begin to thank our speakers enough. It's been, I've had the privilege of jumping from one set of presentations to another from between the rooms, and I know that some of our delegates have actually done that. I want to formally thank Catherine Runswick Cole, Amelie Thompson, Colin Miller, Luke Bearden, Kirsten Darling McQuiston. And Kirsten, I'm worried I've been pronouncing your name wrong. Is it McQuiston or McQuiston?
Okay, as long as you get the Darling part right, I'm fine.
Okay. Margaret Mulholland, Amelia Roberts, Janet Hoskin, Chandrika Devarakonda. I want to thank, of course, Richard Pountney and Victoria Pugh for valiantly stepping in to chair. The top of my list of thank yous are Mette Nilsson from the BERA events team for just putting everything together. A couple of sort of brief announcements from me, coming from BERA, to plug our new small grants call, which is out, and this is really something that is worth promoting with you and your colleagues. These grants are £5,000, Learning for All. They're on the BERA website, so certainly spread the word with your colleagues, particularly those, I'm thinking of colleagues, early career researchers in particular, that might well benefit from something like that. It's important to publicise the next BERA, British Curriculum Forum event, which is on developing language learning across the 4 nations, sharing innovative and creative approaches. Our next event from us will be on the 17th of November 2022. I am just now making sure that I haven't forgotten anything else. I should also say, which is very, very unfair of me, because I haven't put this to any of our speakers yet, but I've just been thinking that it would be lovely if we could put a special edition of the BERA blog together, which is basically condensing your lovely talks into 750 words. I think that might be too good an opportunity to miss, and I think the messages and the discussions today are something that we should just get out in the public domain as quickly as possible. So I'll come back to all of you on that. And it's important for all of our delegates today that everything is being recorded. So if you've been in one of the groups and you're thinking, oh, I wish I was in the other group, you don't have to worry. It's all there. You've got access to all of the recordings. I'm Jerry Cherniavsky. I want to thank everybody once again for an amazing event, and thank you, everybody.